The first thing Lady Adeline Penrose noticed after becoming Duchess of Merrowden was that no one had prepared a chair for her. Hollowmere Castle rose from the Yorkshire moor in a long sweep of grey stone and narrow windows, ancient enough to look less built than summoned out of the earth by pride. Its chapel bell had scarcely stopped trembling from the private wedding when Roland Wycliffe, Duke of Merrowden, led his bride beneath the vaulted passage and into the long gallery, where generations of his family should have watched from woven silk and wool. Instead, the walls were bare, not merely undecorated, stripped. Pale rectangles marked the stone where ancestral tapestries had once hung, each empty shape bordered by a darker stain of age and dust. Chairs stood under holland covers along the wall. A pianoforte rested near the far windows, locked, its polished lid dulled by neglect. The chandeliers overhead held candles, but only a few had been lit, leaving much of the gallery in a soft, accusing dimness. Servants waited in two narrow lines near the door, their faces composed with the severe discipline of a house trained not to expect warmth. Adeline stood in her ivory travelling gown, the lace at her cuffs still faintly damp from the chapel mist, and understood with a clarity that stole her breath. She had not been brought home. She had been placed somewhere. Roland stopped beside a marble-topped table and looked down the length of the gallery as if measuring a battlefield he had already surrendered. He was a tall man, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and so still that even the candlelight seemed uncertain how to touch him. His wedding coat was immaculate. His expression was not cruel. That was worse. Cruelty might have given her something sharp enough to answer. His restraint offered only polished distance. "You will have comfort here," he said, his voice low enough that the servants could pretend not to hear while hearing every word. Quiet, privacy, and no expectation beyond what is proper. Adeline kept her gloved hands folded before her. "That is a generous list, Your Grace." His eyes moved to her then. They were grey, not soft grey, but the colour of rain against leaded glass. "It is an honest one. Honesty is often colder than generosity." Something flickered in his face. It vanished before she could name it. "Hollowmere has been kept in a particular manner for some years. I do not ask you to admire it." "No," she said gently, "only to inhabit it." The housekeeper, a thin woman with silver-threaded hair and a ring of keys at her waist, lowered her gaze as if the remark had struck the floor between them. Roland did not look away from Adeline. "Mrs. Harrow will see to your rooms. You may alter what is necessary for your comfort in the west wing. The east rooms are not to be opened without my instruction." Adeline glanced toward the far end of the gallery, where a pair of double doors stood closed beneath a carved stone falcon. "Are they unsafe?" "They are unnecessary. Those are different conditions. In this house," he said, "they have become the same." The answer moved through the gallery like a draught, touching every cupboard, chair, every unlit candle, every place where colour had once lived and had been removed. Adeline heard a footman breathe in too quickly and stop himself. She did not turn. A duchess learned quickly when being observed became a second ceremony. Only an hour ago, in the chapel, she had promised obedience in the language expected of a bride, yet no vow had prepared her for a husband who could say abandonment with perfect courtesy. Roland drew a folded paper from inside his coat and placed it on the marble table. "The principal household arrangements are written here. Mrs. Harrow has authority over the servants. Mr. Horace Fenman, the steward, manages accounts and estate matters. Should you require anything beyond household comfort, address your request through him." Is Mr. Fenman here? Not today. On the day his new Duchess arrives, he had business in York. The silence after that was almost elegant. Adeline could have filled it with offence. She could have asked whether everyone in Hollowmere had been granted permission to be absent from her welcome. Instead, she looked again at the bare walls and the tapestries. Roland's hand stilled on the edge of the paper. They were removed. For cleaning, for preservation. From what? His jaw tightened. From this house. The answer should have ended the matter. It did not. It opened a door in Adeline's mind and left it ajar. Behind her, the servants waited with the exhausted patience of people who had survived too many forbidden questions. She recognized that patience. Her own childhood at Penrose Hall had taught her the same art. Smile when a father forgot to introduce you. Lower your eyes when an aunt called you sensible in the tone reserved for plain furniture. Accept the room offered, even when it was the smallest one, and learn where the morning sun still found the sill. I see, she said. Roland's expression suggested he doubted it. There is one matter more. Only one. No music in the long gallery. No large gatherings. No unnecessary revival of the Eastern rooms. The word revival struck her more than prohibition would have done. People forbade what they disliked. They feared revival only when something dead had not stayed buried. Does Hollowmere disapprove of music? She asked. Or do you? The nearest maid went utterly still. Mrs. Harrow closed one hand over her key ring to silence its faint tremble. Roland looked at Adeline for a long moment, and in that look she saw not anger but a weariness so old that it had become rank posture and law. I have found silence more reliable. Reliable things are not always kind. Kindness is not the first duty of an old house. No, Adeline said, but it may be the first duty of anyone left inside it. His eyes lowered briefly to her hands, folded so carefully that the fingers had begun to ache. When he looked back at her face, something almost human moved behind the ducal mask. It was gone at once. He bowed, not deeply enough for tenderness, but correctly enough for witnesses. I leave for London before supper. Matters in Parliament require attention. There it was, not a quarrel, not a dramatic cruelty. A carriage waiting in the courtyard, horses already harnessed, servants already informed, bride already disposed of. Adeline felt the humiliation settle on her shoulders as lightly and completely as a veil. She was Duchess of Merrowden. She had been married in a family chapel, brought into a stripped gallery, given rules for silence, and left before the first meal. Then I hope London proves less demanding than Hollowmere, she said. Roland's gaze sharpened. You will not be mistreated here. Is that what you call this? The question was quiet. It did not echo. Perhaps the gallery had forgotten how. For the first time, the Duke seemed unable to produce an immediate answer. Mrs. Harrow's face paled, but Adeline did not regret the words. She had not raised her voice. She had not wept. She had simply placed one honest thing into a room built to avoid them. Roland turned slightly toward the servants. Her Grace is mistress of this house. She is not a guest. She is not temporary. I expect every person under this roof to remember it. A murmur of acknowledgement passed through the lines. Yes, Your Grace. The words should have comforted Adeline. They did not. A title repeated by servants could not warm a chair that had never been uncovered. Roland took his hat and gloves from a footman. As he passed Adeline, the dark wool of his sleeve came near enough that she caught the faint scent of rain, leather, and cedar. He paused as if he meant to say something private. His mouth changed shape around words that never came. Good day, Duchess. Not Adeline, Not wife, Duchess. Good day, your grace." He left through the tall doors, and the castle seemed to exhale only after his footsteps died along the passage. A moment later, carriage wheels sounded on the gravel below. No one moved until they could no longer hear them. Then Mrs. Harrow stepped forward. "Your Grace, shall I show you to the west apartments?" Adeline looked down the gallery once more, bare wall after bare wall, covered chair after covered chair. The locked pianoforte stood with its brass keyhole glinting in the poor light like an eye that had been ordered never to open. In a moment, Mrs. Harrow hesitated. "As your grace wishes." The servants withdrew in careful order, relieved perhaps to escape a bride no one knew how to pity aloud. When the last footman closed the door, Adeline remained in the long gallery alone. The silence did not soften. It pressed against her ears until she could hear the ticking of her own pulse. Outside, the moor wind moved along the windows. Somewhere deep within the castle, a board creaked, then settled back into secrecy. Adeline reached for the small reticule at her wrist. From it, she drew an ivory and ebony tuning fork engraved with the letters AP. The ivory was worn smooth where her mother's thumb had once rested, before illness had thinned her mother's hands and taken the music from Penrose Hall. She had taught Adeline that every room possessed a note, whether or not anyone cared to hear it. "A room can be tuned before it is played," she had said. "People too, perhaps, though most resist the instrument." Adeline held the tuning fork over the marble table. For 1 second, she almost put it away. She was newly married. She was alone. The servants were listening somewhere beyond the walls, because servants in old houses always listened. The Duke had forbidden music. Yet the note she meant to make was not music. It was proof of presence. She struck the fork gently against the table's edge. A clear, slender tone rose into the long gallery. It traveled farther than such a small sound should have traveled. It touched the covered chairs. It climbed the bare walls. It trembled beneath the chandelier candles and returned to her altered, as if the room had answered from a place it had forgotten. Adeline closed her eyes. The note faded, but not at once. It lingered in the emptiness, refusing to die quickly for the sake of anyone's comfort. At the far end of the gallery, beyond the closed door Roland had used, a shadow paused. Adeline did not see it. Roland Wycliffe stood in the corridor with his hat still in his hand, and his servant waiting 3 paces behind him. He had turned back for no reason he intended to confess, perhaps to retrieve a word, perhaps to make certain she had not cried. Then the note reached him, thin, pure, impossible. His hand tightened around the silver head of his cane until his knuckles whitened. For an instant his face was not ducal at all. It was a man's face, struck by memory before pride could defend him. Then he stepped back from the door. "The carriage, your grace," the footman whispered. Roland looked once at the closed gallery doors. "Yes." He went away. Inside the long gallery, Adeline opened her eyes. The final thread of sound vanished. In its place, something caught her attention on the wall nearest the covered pianoforte. A tiny mark of color remained where everything else had been taken. She crossed the floor slowly, her skirts whispering against stone. Near a dark iron nail, almost hidden in the shadow of an empty rectangle, a red and gold thread clung to the wall. It was no longer than the first joint of her finger. Not dust, not cobweb, wool, perhaps silk, twisted in 2 colors and frayed at one end, as though it had been torn away in haste. Adeline lifted her hand but did not touch it. If the tapestries had gone for preservation, why had a thread been left like blood under a nail? Behind her, The locked pianoforte reflected a faint line of candlelight. Before her, the bare wall held its secret. Adeline stood very still, the tuning fork warm now in her palm. The Duke had given her an empty castle and walked away, but empty things did not leave threads behind. By the third morning after the wedding, Lady Adeline Wycliffe had learned that Hollowmere Castle did not merely keep silence. It organized silence, recorded it, dusted it, and gave it keys. Mrs. Harrow had shown her the West apartments with grave efficiency, had answered questions about linen, fires, breakfast hours, and servants' names, and had avoided every inquiry that touched the long gallery as neatly as a maid, avoiding a loose floorboard. But Adeline had been raised in his house, where avoidance carried more truth than confession. When a person did not answer, the room did. When a servant lowered her eyes too quickly, the past had brushed against her sleeve. On the morning in question, pale Yorkshire light pressed against the windows of the small estate office adjoining the steward's room, and Adeline stood before a tall cupboard of household records with the torn red and gold thread still untouched on the gallery wall behind her in memory. She had not removed it, not yet. Evidence, her mother had once said while mending a torn hem, was like silk, pulled too hard and the whole fabric distorted. So Adeline had done what no one in Hollowmere seemed to expect from a bride abandoned with courtesy. She began with inventory. The household books are usually kept by Mr. Fenman, Mrs. Harrow said from the doorway, her fingers resting on the key ring at her waist. Usually, Adeline replied, is a useful word when Mr. Fenman is present. The housekeeper looked pained. His Grace has long trusted Mr. Fenman with matters of estate arrangement. His Grace has also long trusted these walls to remain bare. I am not certain trust has served either very well. Mrs. Harrow's lips parted, then closed. She was not an unkind woman. Adeline had decided that on the first evening, when the housekeeper sent up warmed bricks for the bed without comment and arranged a supper tray that included tea, strong enough for grief and eggs, fresh enough for dignity. But kindness in Hollowmere had learned to move quietly, as though permission might be withdrawn if it made a sound. Your Grace, Mrs. Harrow said at last, some matters in this house are old. Old things are not always sacred. Adeline drew open the inventory ledger and turned it so the morning light fell across the page. Sometimes they are simply waiting for someone to read them. The ledger smelled of leather, dust, and ink long settled into paper. The entries had been written by several hands across decades. Older pages bore ornamental flourishes and careful descriptions. Later pages grew thinner, more practical, less affectionate. There were lists of bed hangings, silver, chapel plate, gallery chairs, painted screens, damask coverings, and fire irons. Then, beginning 12 years earlier, came a change. Removed, removed, removed. The word appeared again and again, beside objects that should have formed the memory of a ducal house. Adeline followed the columns with her finger until she found the section marked Long Gallery. 12 Wycliffe tapestries, each with title and position. The Falcon Returns at Dawn, The Stag at Wintermere, The Three Brides of Wycliffe, The Chapel Oath, The Red Hunt, The Eastward Ship. One by one, all were marked, removed for moth treatment. No return date, no conservator's signature, no receipt number, no note of storage, Mrs. Harrow. Adeline said softly, how long ago were the tapestries removed? The housekeeper's gaze did not leave the ledger, but a faint tightness appeared around her eyes. In stages, Your Grace. That is not a date. The first after Lady Eleanor's death, others later, Eleanor. The name had not yet been spoken to Adeline in any full way, only hinted at by the closed eastern rooms, and by the Duke's face when music entered the air. "Lady Eleanor Wycliffe," Adeline said. "His Grace's sister." Mrs. Harrow inclined her head. "Yes, Your Grace." And no one thought it strange that 12 ancestral tapestries were sent away for treatment and never returned. The housekeeper's hand tightened around the keys. It was not for servants to think it strange. "No," Adeline said, "only to live with the absence." Before Mrs. Harrow could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor, brisk, controlled, and too confident to belong to anyone uncertain of welcome. A man entered without waiting to be announced. He was in his early 50s, narrow-faced, well-dressed in dark wool, with sandy brows and an expression trained to appear respectful, without yielding anything of importance. He bowed with polished correctness. "Your Grace." "Horace Fenman, steward to His Grace." Adeline closed the ledger halfway, but kept one gloved hand upon it. "Mr. Fenman, you have returned from York." "Late last evening, Your Grace. I was informed you wished to inspect certain records." "I did. Naturally, I am at your disposal." His smile was modest. His eyes moved at once to the open ledger. "Though I fear household inventories make dull company for a new bride. I have found dull company more revealing than lively flattery." Mrs. Harrow lowered her eyes. Fenman's smile did not falter, but it paused, which pleased Adeline more than she allowed herself to show. "Then I hope the books have entertained Your Grace." "They have raised questions. Old houses do tend to do that." "Do they also tend to misplace 12 tapestries?" He gave a small laugh, almost paternal. "Ah, the long gallery hangings. A melancholy business, but hardly mysterious. Moth, damp, neglect over many generations. Such things must be handled by men who know the trade." "Which men?" "Conservators engaged through York contacts." "Their names? I would have to consult the estate papers." "Please do. At once, when the relevant boxes are sorted." Adeline looked at him steadily. "They are not sorted." "Older papers, Your Grace, rarely are. Yet the decision to strip an ancestral gallery must have produced receipts." Fenman folded his hands behind his back. "Undoubtedly. Then I would like copies." That caused the smallest change in his expression. Not alarm. Something more practiced than alarm. Adjustment. "Of course. I shall have them prepared. Today? That may not be possible." "Tomorrow, then." "I should hate to promise what old storage may not provide." "How considerate." Adeline opened the ledger again and turned it toward him. "This entry says, 'The Falcon returns at dawn, was removed for moth treatment 9 years ago.' The ink differs from the entries above it. The handwriting, too. Do you know who wrote it?" Fenman leaned forward only enough to glance at the page. "A clerk formerly employed by the estate, I believe." "His name?" "I cannot say without checking. So many things require checking." The words were mild, but Mrs. Harrow looked toward the window as if suppressing something. Fenman's gaze returned to Adeline. "Your Grace must understand. Hollowmere has endured difficult years. His Grace preferred certain rooms left undisturbed. My duty has been to preserve order. Order is not the same as accuracy, no, but in a noble house, order is often what prevents pain from spreading." There it was again. The castle's favorite sermon. Pain must be contained, questions must be folded away, music must be locked, walls must remain bare because someone powerful had found emptiness easier to manage than memory. Adeline closed the ledger with care. "Mr. Fenman, I do not intend to tear open grief for amusement. No one would accuse Your Grace of such a thing." His voice was smooth enough to be insulting. "But you might accuse me of troubling myself with old fabric." This time he bowed his head. I would only wish to spare you unnecessary concerns. I have been given a castle, Mr. Fenman. I find its missing walls a necessary concern." The steward said nothing. Silence again. But this silence did not belong to sorrow. It belonged to calculation. Adeline knew the difference. After Fenman withdrew with a promise to search the York papers, Adeline remained in the office until Mrs. Harrow also left, called away by a question from the kitchen. Only then did Adeline return to the long gallery. The morning had brightened, revealing more clearly the pale wounds on the walls where tapestries had hung. Servants had passed through earlier, but no one lingered there willingly. Perhaps the gallery made them feel accused. Perhaps it made them feel watched by what was absent. Near the bench below the easternmost empty panel, Adeline noticed that the Holland cover had been disturbed. Not much. A corner folded under. She crouched carefully, mindful of her skirts, and lifted the edge. Beneath the bench, caught between a loose floor splinter and the stone, lay a strip of woven border no longer than her hand. Red and gold threads framed a small falcon worked in dark wool. At first, relief moved through her, a piece of the missing tapestry. Then her breath slowed. She had seen the Wycliffe falcon, carved above the eastern doors, stamped on writing paper, and engraved on the chapel plate during the wedding. The bird always faced right, wings angled upward, beak lifted toward dawn. This falcon faced left. Wrong. Reversed. A copy, perhaps, a mistake, or proof that someone had replaced truth with imitation. Adeline did not touch it with bare fingers. She drew a clean square of muslin from the sewing basket she had asked to be brought that morning, lifted the selvage gently, and laid it inside. The woven scrap was dry, dusty, and frayed at one end, not burned, not rotten beyond use. She folded the muslin once, then wrote the date on the outside with a pencil from her reticule. 3rd day after arrival. Found beneath eastern bench in long gallery. Reversed falcon. As she rose, a whisper came from near the doorway. Her Grace's empty kingdom has found treasure. A young under-footman froze as soon as the words escaped him. He could not have been more than 17. His ears reddened. The older footman beside him stared ahead with the rigid despair of a man already imagining dismissal. Adeline looked at the boy for a long moment. His face held fear, not malice. The words had been foolish, but not invented by him alone. Houses taught servants what could be joked about. "What is your name?" she asked. He swallowed. "Thomas, Your Grace." "Thomas, fetch a measuring tape from the linen room." He blinked. "Your Grace, you called this my empty kingdom. If so, I ought to know its dimensions." The older footman's mouth twitched before discipline conquered it. Thomas bowed so quickly he nearly struck his own knee. "Yes, Your Grace. Right away, Your Grace." When he ran, Adeline permitted herself the smallest smile. Not triumph. Not amusement exactly. A correction. If the house expected her to punish every nervous tongue, it had mistaken her. She would not build authority from fear. Fear had already done enough decorating in Hollowmere. By afternoon, the long gallery had changed in one measurable way. Its walls remained bare, but their lengths, heights, nail positions, and missing panel marks were recorded in Adeline's hand. Thomas held the ladder. Mrs. Harrow, after a long internal battle, brought chalk and additional paper. Even the older footman admitted that the second panel had once been wider than the others, because the old red hunting piece took near the whole wall, according to my father. No one said the castle felt warmer. That would have been too much too soon, but people remained in the room longer than they had the day before. That was something. Near dusk, Adeline sat at the small writing table in her west sitting room. The muslin packet lay beside her left hand. The tuning fork lay beside her right. She did not strike it, not now. This letter required no music. She dipped her pen, considered the proper form, and began. Your Grace gave me walls. I am asking what was taken from them. She paused, then continued with restraint. She did not accuse Fenman. She did not mention her humiliation. She listed facts. 12 tapestries removed. No return dates, no accessible receipts. A woven selvage found beneath the eastern bench, bearing the Wycliffe falcon reversed. She requested permission to examine any related family correspondence that did not intrude upon private grief. Then she signed herself with deliberate clarity. Adeline, Duchess of Merrowden, in London. 2 days later, Roland Wycliffe read the letter beneath the green-shaded lamp of his library at Merrowden House in Mayfair. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Parliamentary papers lay unopened beside him. He had expected complaints, perhaps, or loneliness disguised as civility, or a request for more servants, more candles, more comfort. He had not expected walls. He had not expected the phrase, "what was taken from them." He read it once, then again. On the third reading, the room seemed to lose its edges. Eleanor had asked the same question years before, standing in the long gallery with ink on her fingers and music sheets under her arm. What was taken from them, Roland? People don't strip a house because moths were hungry. He set Adeline's letter down. For a moment, he did not move. Then he reached for the bell, stopped himself, and looked toward the rain-dark window as if Yorkshire could be seen through it. His wife had been in Hollowmere 3 days. Already, she was counting the walls, the first sign that Hollowmere had begun to resist its own silence came on the 7th morning, when a hymn rose from the small morning room and stopped every servant in the corridor. It was not a performance. It was barely even music at first. 3 women's voices, one uncertain footman's baritone, and the thin, careful notes of the pianoforte joined together beneath the pale light of a Yorkshire Sunday. Adeline had not opened the long gallery. She had not touched the eastern rooms. She had obeyed every written prohibition. Roland had left behind, and still she had found a way for the house to breathe. The morning room lay in the west wing, a modest chamber with faded green silk on the walls and windows, facing a clipped yew walk. Its chairs had been uncovered the day before. Its curtains had been shaken free of dust. A small fire had been lit not for spectacle, but because Mrs. Harrow admitted, after 3 days of resistance, that servants' hands worked better when they were not stiff with cold. The pianoforte there was smaller than the one in the long gallery and badly out of tune. But the old music maid, Mrs. Vale, had wept when Adeline asked whether it could still play a hymn for household prayers. "It'll complain, Your Grace," Mrs. Vale had said, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Most neglected things do," Adeline replied. "Let us not hold that against it." Now Mrs. Vale pressed the notes with reverent caution, and the voices followed. Adeline stood near the window with a prayer book open in her hands. Though she knew the words, Thomas, the under-footman, who had once called the gallery her empty kingdom, sang too softly until Adeline glanced at him and gave one small nod. His voice strengthened. The sound was plain, unfashionable, imperfect, yet it moved through the west wing with a sincerity no polished assembly could have purchased. It reached the corridor. It reached the stair. It reached the stone entrance hall at the precise moment. Roland Wycliffe crossed it in a travel-dark coat, still damp from mist. He had arrived sooner than his own note had promised. His carriage stood below. horses steaming in the chill morning air, a groom at their heads. Roland had intended to ask questions in the estate office, summon Fenman, inspect the long gallery, and leave before Hollowmere remembered his presence. Then he heard music. He stopped so sharply that the footman behind him nearly struck his shoulder with the valise. "Your Grace," the man whispered. Roland raised one hand. The hymn continued, not Eleanor's bright, laughing scales, not the furious crash of keys from a girl who had argued with him until the winter rain took her beyond recall. This sound was lower, humbler, gathered from ordinary throats in an ordinary room. It should not have hurt. It should not have mattered, yet something inside him tightened with such force that he had to set his cane against the floor and wait until the world steadied. At the last verse, a woman's voice rose just above the others. Adeline. She did not sing loudly. She did not sing as if she wished to be admired. She simply held the line when the others faltered, and by holding it, gave them courage to finish. The hymn ended, silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. Roland moved down the corridor before he had decided to do so. The door to the morning room stood open. Adeline looked up first, perhaps because she had learned already to feel the castle's changes before anyone announced them. Mrs. Vale snatched her hands from the keys. Thomas straightened as if preparing for judgment. Mrs. Harrow went pale. Roland took in the uncovered chairs, the mended curtain folded over a work table, the prayer books, the servants standing not in fear but in awkward surprise. Then his eyes settled on his wife. "I forbade music in the long gallery," Adeline said before he could speak. Her calm did not challenge him. It placed fact between them like a candle. Roland's gaze moved to the small pianoforte. "You found another instrument." Hollowmere had not misplaced all of them. "That was not my meaning." "No," she said, "but it was nearly your rule." Thomas's face suggested he wished he could disappear through the carpet. Mrs. Harrow stared at the prayer book in her hands. Roland felt every servant waiting for the blow of rank. He had delivered such blows before, not with cruelty, but with the cold efficiency of a man who believed command was cleaner than explanation. He looked at Adeline and found no triumph there. That unsettled him more than defiance would have done. She had not staged a victory. She had gathered a household for prayers. She had made the smallest possible sound that still counted as life. "Leave us," he said. Mrs. Harrow began to move. Adeline closed her prayer book. "No." The word was soft, but it held. Roland turned back to her. "No. If your concern is the servants' participation, they should hear the rule from both of us. If your concern is me, then I will hear it without witnesses." A flicker crossed his face. Annoyance, perhaps, or reluctant respect. He looked toward the servants. "No one will be reprimanded for this morning." Breath moved through the room. Mrs. Vale looked down quickly, but not before Adeline saw tears brighten her eyes. "However," Roland continued, "no further gathering is to be arranged without my knowledge." Adeline inclined her head. "Then now you know." It was almost a smile. Almost. Before he could answer, a sharp crack sounded from beyond the corridor. Not loud enough to be a gunshot, too heavy to be a dropped tray. Roland turned at once. Another sound followed, a wooden groan from the direction of the long gallery. Adeline was already moving. He caught up with her, near the gallery doors, the servants behind them, at a frightened distance. Inside, the long room lay as bare as before, but the easternmost wall bracket had shifted. A tapestry rod, one of the old support poles, still mounted beneath an empty panel, sagged at one end. As Adeline stepped beneath it, the loosened bracket gave way. Roland moved without thought. He reached her in 2 strides, caught her by the upper arm only long enough to draw her back, and seized the falling rod with his other hand. The weight struck his palm and forced his shoulder down. Adeline's hand rose instinctively to steady the rod near his. For one suspended instant, their fingers met against the dark wood. Her glove brushed his bare knuckles. His hand trembled, not from the weight. She felt it. So did he. The last note of the hymn seemed to exist between them still, though no instrument sounded. Adeline looked from their joined hands to his face. His expression was rigid, but his eyes had gone strangely unguarded. Then he released the rod into the grip of a footman who hurried forward at his command. "Take it down, carefully." The footman obeyed. Roland turned to the bracket. The screws were not merely old, they had been worked loose. Fresh marks brightened the metal where a tool had bitten recently. His jaw hardened. "Who has been in this gallery?" Fenman's voice answered from the doorway, smooth and breathless. "Your Grace, I came as soon as I heard. I warned that these unused rooms should not be disturbed." Roland did not look at him. "That is not what I asked." Fenman bowed. "Her Grace has had servants measuring walls, moving covers, examining old fixtures. No doubt some accident was invited by the activity." Adeline felt the old trap closing, the reasonable tone, the concern that placed blame while appearing to avoid it. She stepped toward the bracket before Roland could speak for her. "Mr. Fenman, the rod fell from a wall I had not touched today. The screws show recent marks. If servants had loosened them under my direction, they would remember doing so." Fenman smiled faintly. Servants often forget what frightens them. Roland finally turned. The room chilled around the change in his face. Her Grace did not make this gallery unsafe. Someone left it so. Fenman's smile died politely, which was to say not entirely. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant only that closed rooms sometimes punish curiosity." Adeline looked at him. "Rooms do not punish curiosity. People do." The words landed harder than she had intended, but she did not withdraw them. Roland's eyes moved briefly to her, and in that glance she saw something new, not warmth yet. Recognition, perhaps even the beginning of alliance. He bent toward the bracket and ran his thumb near the loosened screw. When he straightened, a tiny fleck of red wax clung to his skin. He stared at it, then at the seal on a folded note protruding from Fenman's coat pocket. The colors were close, not proof, not yet, but enough to sharpen the air. Adeline saw the same thing and said nothing. Evidence, like silk, distorted when pulled too quickly. Roland took out his handkerchief, wiped the wax fleck into its fold, and handed it to Mrs. Harrow. "Keep this in my study until Mr. Quesnel arrives." Fenman blinked. "The solicitor, Your Grace?" "Yes. May I ask why such a measure is necessary?" "You may ask." Roland's voice was even. "You may not require an answer." The silence that followed was different from Hollowmere's old silence. It had teeth. The servants watched their duke, then their duchess, and for the first time, Adeline sensed not pity in them, but attention. Roland looked toward the small morning room, where the pianoforte had fallen quiet after its first brave hymn. His expression tightened again, though not with anger alone. "There will be no music after dusk." Adeline turned to him slowly, but before dusk, he met her eyes. Several answers seemed to pass behind his own before he allowed one to live. "Before dusk," he said, "I will be informed." It was not permission dressed as kindness. It was not apology. It was a concession wrested from some guarded room inside him. Adeline accepted it as such. "Then I shall inform you, Your Grace." His gaze lowered once, not to her mouth or her figure, but to the place where their hands had touched on the rod. When he looked back at her, the ducal mask had returned, yet it no longer fit him perfectly. "Roland," he said quietly, so quietly only she could hear. "When there are no witnesses, my name is Roland." Adeline's breath caught despite herself. A name was not tenderness, it was not trust, but in Hollowmere, where every room had been ordered silent, even a name could sound like the first opening of a door. "Then you may call me Adeline," she said, "when there are no witnesses." Behind them, Fenman stood very still. On the wall, the empty panel waited, and in Mrs. Harrow's careful hand, wrapped inside the Duke's folded handkerchief, the small red fleck of wax began its quiet journey from accident to evidence. Lady Euphemia Staveley arrived at Hollowmere on the second Tuesday after the wedding, carrying enough concern to make every servant lower his eyes. Her carriage came up the East Drive shortly after. Luncheon, glossy black, with a discreet crest painted on the door, and stopped beneath the stone arch, as if the castle had been expecting her all along. Adeline watched from the west sitting-room window, one hand resting on the folded muslin packet that held the torn selvage. The packet had been locked in her writing desk since the morning the gallery rod fell. The red wax fleck remained in the Duke's folded handkerchief under Mrs. Harrow's keeping in Roland's study, waiting for Mr. Quennell's arrival. Nothing had been moved without being noted. Nothing had been touched without purpose. That small order steadied her when the caller stepped down from the carriage. Lady Euphemia was not young in the fragile debutante sense, but she possessed the polished beauty of a woman who had never entered a room without knowing which chair belonged to influence. Her dark blue gown was cut with expensive restraint. Her bonnet ribbon matched her gloves. Even her smile seemed selected from a locked cabinet of correct expressions. "Mrs. Harrow announced her with visible unease. "Lady Euphemia Staveley, Your Grace." Adeline rose. "Lady Euphemia." Euphemia crossed the threshold with both hands extended, though not quite far enough to require an embrace. "Duchess, I came the moment I heard Roland had returned to Hollowmere. You must forgive the intrusion. Old friends grow anxious when old wounds are disturbed." Adeline allowed her hands to be taken for exactly the length of time courtesy required. Hollowmere seems to have many old wounds. I'm still learning which are permitted to be named. Euphemia's smile softened in a manner meant to look sympathetic. "Ah, you have courage. That can be a blessing in a young wife, provided it is not spent too quickly. I hope to spend it accurately." A faint pause. Then Euphemia turned to the room. Her gaze moved over the uncovered chairs, the mended curtain folded by the window, the small vase of late garden chrysanthemums that Mrs. Harrow had placed there without being asked. How industrious. "You have already altered the west wing, only awakened it. What a pretty word." Euphemia looked back at her. "Roland has always mistrusted pretty words. Then I shall try to use useful ones." Mrs. Harrow asked whether tea should be brought. Adeline agreed, not because she wanted tea, but because servants' presence gave shape to a conversation that wished to become private too soon. When Roland entered 10 minutes later, he stopped just inside the door. He had not expected Euphemia. That was clear before his face recovered. "Lady Euphemia." "Not Euphemia. Not my dear friend. Lady Euphemia." Adeline noticed so did their guest. "Roland," Euphemia said, with a warmth that slightly overreached its rights. "You look tired." "I was not informed you were coming." "No, I feared if I wrote first, you would refuse." That would have been possible. The words were cool, but not cruel. Euphemia laughed softly. as if she alone understood the affectionate meaning beneath them. "You see, Duchess, he has not changed, still determined to treat concern as an invasion. Concern often enters without knocking," Adeline said. Roland's glance touched her, brief and unreadable. The tea arrived. Mrs. Harrow placed the tray with steady hands, but her attention flickered once toward the corridor leading to the long gallery. Euphemia took the chair nearest Roland before Adeline could indicate another. It was a small move, a practiced one. Adeline sat opposite, rather than compete for proximity. The space between husband and wife had been made public on their wedding day. She would not repair it by tugging at chairs. "I hear you have been opening rooms," Euphemia said, accepting her cup, measuring walls, encouraging prayers with music. "How quickly Hollowmere changes under new rule." "Not rule," Adeline said. "Care, a beautiful distinction. But houses like this are not cottages. They do not always benefit from being made cheerful." Roland's hand stilled near his cup. "No one has made Hollowmere cheerful. Not yet, perhaps." Euphemia lowered her eyes. "Forgive me. I only mean that some silences here were chosen for mercy." Adeline heard the word and disliked it at once. Mercy had been used too often by people who wanted obedience, thanked as kindness. Mercy for whom? Euphemia looked faintly wounded. For Roland, naturally, and for poor Eleanor's memory. The name shifted the room. Roland did not move, but some inward gate closed. Adeline saw it happen. A breath earlier he had been a guarded man. Now he was a duke made of stone again. "Lady Eleanor loved music, I believe," Adeline said. Euphemia's gaze sharpened before it softened. "Too much, perhaps. Some young women mistake noise for feeling." Roland's voice was quiet. "That is enough. I meant no offense." "You rarely do," he said. Euphemia accepted the correction with a bowed head, but she did not retreat. "Duchess, you must understand. Eleanor filled these rooms with sound until the house itself seemed unable to rest. After her death, Roland preserved what peace he could. It would be cruel to mistake that peace for neglect." Adeline set her cup down. "And would it be cruel to ask where the tapestries went?" Mrs. Harrow, who had remained near the tea table, almost imperceptibly drew in breath. Euphemia looked at Adeline as one might look at a child who had lifted a cloth from a corpse. "The tapestries. The long gallery once held 12. "Yes, of course. I remember them." "Do you?" Adeline asked. "Then perhaps you can help me. Which tapestry hung to the left of the eastern doors?" Euphemia's answer came too smoothly. "The falcon returns at dawn, if I recall." The falcon faced the windows, wings lowered. A somber thing. Roland turned his head. "No." The single word cut through the room. Euphemia blinked. "No, the falcon faced the chapel end. Wings raised. Did it? How foolish of me. It has been years." Adeline did not look at the locked desk where the reversed selvage rested. She did not need to. The wrongness had just spoken aloud. "Memories reverse themselves when rooms are left empty," she said. Euphemia's fingers tightened on her saucer, or when new arrivals make inquiries without knowing what they disturb. Roland set down his cup. "My wife is entitled to inquire." Euphemia's smile thinned. "Entitled, yes, but entitlement is not always tenderness. A wounded house can be handled too eagerly." "Her Grace is not an intruder in my house." The words were measured, but they changed the air. Mrs. Harrow lowered her eyes at once. Adeline felt the force of them without allowing herself to lean toward it. Protection was not trust. Still, after a week of closed doors, his public correction placed one candle in a room that had expected darkness. Euphemia rose, graceful as a blade returning to its sheath. "Then I am relieved to hear it. I feared only that grief might be dressed as restoration. No, Adeline said. She stood too. Grief is more often dressed as silence. Roland looked at her then, not sharply, not with warning, with the same still attention he had given the sound of the tuning fork before he left the gallery on their wedding day. Adeline did not soften the truth. Music does not belong to the dead simply because the living are afraid of hearing it. Euphemia's face lost its smile for the space of one heartbeat. You speak boldly for a lady who has been here a week. I listen carefully for the same reason. Roland's mouth moved as if he might answer, but he did not. His silence now was not dismissal. It was struggle. Euphemia seemed to recognize that struggle and resent it. She turned toward him with sudden gentleness. Roland, I only ask that you remember what happened when Eleanor made this house perform for strangers. You know what followed. He went very still. I remember my sister without assistance. The reply should have ended the visit. Euphemia curtsied with faultless elegance and requested to be shown to the guest chamber she had apparently assumed would be available. Roland hesitated long enough for insult to form. Then he said, Mrs. Harrow will arrange a room for one night. One. How kind. Euphemia's glance moved to Adeline. We shall have time to become better acquainted. I expect we shall become accurately acquainted, Adeline said. That evening, Roland did not leave Hollowmere. The fact passed through the servants more swiftly than any spoken order. A tray was set for him in the library, then removed untouched. Adeline remained in the west sitting room, entering notes into her small book. Euphemia recalls falcon direction incorrectly. Connect to reversed selvage. Claims Eleanor loved noise too much. Uses grief to justify silence. She locked the book herself and placed the muslin packet back in the writing desk. The tuning fork lay beside the inkstand, unstruck. She had no wish to summon sound, merely to prove she could. Near midnight, when the castle had settled into its layered creaks and hushes, Adeline woke in her chair to a sound beyond the door. Not music, a footstep, then another, too careful for a servant on ordinary work. She rose, took the small chamber candle, and opened the door into the corridor. The passage was empty. At the far end, the long gallery door stood closed, as it should, yet she could feel disturbance as plainly as a draught. She did not go farther. Alone at midnight, a duchess did not chase shadows through a house, still learning whether it belonged to her. Instead, she returned to her room and checked the writing desk. The lock had not been broken. But when she opened the drawer, the muslin packet was not as she had left it. The fold faced left instead of right. The pencil note was smudged at the edge. The selvage remained inside, dry, frayed, reversed, and exactly where she had placed it. Someone had opened it. Someone had wanted to know whether she had understood what she had found. Adeline refolded the muslin with steady fingers. Then she took up her pencil and added one line beneath the date. Packet disturbed during Lady Euphemia's first night at Hollowmere. She did not strike the tuning fork. She did not call for Roland. Not yet. In a house built on silence, the first rule of truth was patience. By breakfast the next morning, the muslin packet lay exactly where Adeline had placed it, but certainty had altered the room more thoroughly than any thief could have done. She had slept little, not from fear, though fear would have been reasonable enough in a castle where a sealed drawer could be opened and folded evidence disturbed under the roof of a duke who had promised she was not temporary. What kept her awake was calculation. Someone had entered her private sitting room or persuaded someone else to do so. Someone had opened the packet, seen the reversed falcon, and put it back clumsily enough to be noticed. If the intention had been theft, the selvage would be gone. If the intention had been warning, the drawer would have been left open. This was neither. It was an inspection. By noon, Adeline had copied the note from the packet into her private book, locked the selvage away again, and asked Mrs. Harrow to keep a record of every person who requested access to the West Corridor. She did not accuse Lady Euphemia. She did not mention Mr. Fenman. Accusations were expensive things in houses where reputation mattered more than truth. A woman with no proof could spend her whole dignity on one and be called hysterical for the trouble. Instead, she walked to the small morning room and found Roland standing beside the pianoforte with her tuning fork in his hand. The sight stopped her just inside the doorway. The room was bright with late morning light. The mended curtain lay over the chair where Mrs. Vale had left it. Dust motes drifted above the instrument like notes no one had yet played. Roland had not struck the fork. He held it with a care that seemed almost too gentle for his long, controlled fingers. "That belongs to you," Adeline said. He turned at once, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw something like embarrassment pass across his face. "It was on the music stand. I left it there yesterday after Mrs. Vale checked the pitch. I should not have touched it. You have touched many things in this house, Your Grace. Some of them suffered more than this." His mouth changed, almost into a smile, but restraint defeated it. "Roland," he said quietly, "the correction should not have warmed her. It did, only a little, enough to be inconvenient." "Roland," she said, and watched the name reach him. He looked back at the tuning fork. "A.P. Adeline Penrose. Your mother's?" "Yes." He did not ask carelessly. That mattered. Men who had never lacked inheritance often treated women's small possessions as sentimental clutter, useful only because they proved a softness men could patronize. Roland looked at the fork as if it had survived something. She played, she taught. Mostly piano, sometimes voice, always patience. She believed every room had a note it preferred. That sounds fanciful. It sounded less fanciful when she could make a room of arguing children go quiet with a single chord. "A rare accomplishment," she said. "A room can be tuned before it is played." Adeline stepped farther inside, but not too close. Their nearness still felt like a language neither of them knew well enough to speak without injury. People too, perhaps, though most resist the instrument. Roland looked toward the covered eastern passage beyond the open door. "Some rooms resist for cause. I do not doubt it, and yet you continue, because cause is not the same as cure." He looked at her then, and the guard in his eyes thinned just enough for pain to show through. Eleanor played in the long gallery. The name entered the room more softly than it had at tea with Euphemia. There it had been a weapon. Here it sounded like something carried with both hands. Adeline did not move. I thought she might have. She played too loudly when she was pleased, and worse when she was angry. She had a habit of beginning in the middle of a piece because she said beginnings were for people who needed permission. His voice roughened at the edge so slightly another woman might have missed it. She would play while guests were still removing their gloves. She would play while our aunt was speaking. She would play at dusk when every sensible person wanted candles and order. You loved her very much. He closed his hand around the tuning fork, then opened it again at once, as if afraid of marking it. I failed her very much. The simple violence of that sentence held Adeline silent. He had not said she died. He had not said illness or accident or winter journey. He had said failed. That was not history. That was a wound still taking instruction from the past. "You don't have to tell me what you don't wish to tell me," she said. His gaze returned to hers, sharper because she had not pressed him. Most people press. Most people prefer confession when it belongs to someone else. And you, I prefer truth that does not have to be dragged bleeding into the room. For one heartbeat, he looked as if those words had reached a place where rank could not follow. Then footsteps approached, and the moment folded itself away. Mr. Fenman appeared at the doorway with a sealed paper in hand. He paused at the sight of them, then bowed. "Your Grace, Duchess, forgive the interruption." Roland's face altered so quickly, Adeline almost mourned the man who had been there a second before. "What is it?" Fenman offered the paper with careful humility, a note located among old storage papers. "It concerns the long gallery hangings. I thought it might relieve Her Grace's anxiety." Adeline accepted the word anxiety without blinking. Roland took the paper, glanced at the seal, and opened it. His eyes moved down the page. "Read it aloud," Adeline said. Fenman's brows lifted. "Your Grace, if it concerns my anxiety, I should like to hear its cure." Roland handed her the paper instead. She read the first line and felt the room become very still. The note claimed that the Wycliffe tapestries had been inspected by a York conservation firm 11 years earlier and found moth-eaten beyond repair. It recommended discreet disposal to prevent embarrassment, further expense, and distress to His Grace. The date seemed old enough to matter. The language seemed official enough to soothe a careless reader. But Adeline had spent years copying her mother's music accounts and Penrose household letters. She knew the feel of paper as well as she knew the feel of a key beneath a finger. "This paper is too fresh," she said. Fenman gave a soft, regretful smile. "Paper can be stored well, Your Grace. Ink can fade badly. This has not. Perhaps the storage chest was dry. Perhaps." She held the sheet toward the window. "The watermark is visible." Roland stepped closer, not touching her. Close enough that she felt the shift of his attention like warmth across her sleeve. The paper held a faint manufacturer's mark. Adeline read it twice. This stationer was not supplying the estate 11 years ago. Fenman's eyes cooled. "Your Grace has a remarkable familiarity with stationery. Women are often given letters when they are denied authority. We learn from what we are allowed to hold." Roland took the paper from her, not abruptly, and examined the mark. "Where did you find this?" Fenman bowed. "In a box removed from the old steward's cabinet." "Which box?" "I can show Your Grace." "You will." Roland folded the note once. "Mrs. Harrow will send for Mr. Quesnel again. I want the conservation firm verified." "The solicitor has already been written to regarding the wax fleck," Fenman said. It was almost too quick. Adeline looked at him. Roland did too. "You knew that?" the Duke asked. Fenman's face corrected itself. "Mrs. Harrow mentioned that certain small items had been preserved. I assumed the matter was still of interest." "You assume carefully," Adeline said. "In service, Duchess, careful assumptions prevent disorder." Roland's voice lowered. "Then prevent it elsewhere. Leave us." Fenman bowed and withdrew, but the room did not clear with him. Suspicion remained behind, seated comfortably in every chair. Adeline placed the note on the music stand beside the tuning fork. He brought that too conveniently. Yes, and too late. "Yes," she looked at him. "You believe that? I believe paper should not be trusted simply because it arrives dressed as an answer." It was not an apology. It was not yet belief in her, but it was belief in the question. And Adeline had learned to value beginnings that did not pretend to be endings. Roland looked down at the tuning fork. May I? She understood before he finished. The request moved between them with more weight than the object deserved. He had held it without asking once. Now he asked. That was not a grand gesture. It was better. Yes, she said. He lifted the fork and struck it lightly against the edge of the pianoforte. The note rose, clear and slender, filling the room without demanding it. Roland closed his eyes. The sound touched his face first, softening the hard line of his mouth, then tightening it with memory. Adeline watched grief pass through him like weather across stone. When the tone faded, he opened his eyes and held the tuning fork out. Then he stopped. May I return it properly? Her breath caught, though nothing improper had been asked. You may. He placed the stem across her palm. His fingers did not close over hers until she let her hand remain open beneath his. Then, very gently, he curved her fingers around the ivory and ebony handle. The contact lasted only a moment. His skin was warm. His touch was careful, almost reverent, and gone before it could become a claim. Yet after he released her, Adeline still felt the shape of his hand, as if the note had entered her palm and stayed there. Thank you, he said, for lending it, for not making me explain before I could breathe. She looked at him, and the answer she gave was quieter than she intended. One should not punish a man for being wounded, only for using the wound as a lock on every door. His eyes held hers. And have I done that? Yes, the word did not strike him. It entered him. Then I will have to learn where the locks are. Before Adeline could answer, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Harrow entered with a silver salver and a letter marked from York. For His Grace, from Mr. Quennell's clerk. Roland broke the seal and read. Adeline watched the change before he spoke it. The conservation firm named in Fenman's note closed 6 years ago. He looked at the false paper on the music stand, then at the tuning fork in Adeline's hand. 11 years ago, it could not have written this. The morning room seemed to listen. This time, Adeline did not strike the fork. The truth had made its own sound. The first invitation, Adeline wrote, was not grand enough to frighten the house. And that was why Roland distrusted it. She sat at the little walnut desk in the west sitting room on the 3rd Monday after her arrival, choosing her words with more care than another woman might have spent on diamonds. The note was addressed to Mrs. Alton, the vicar's wife, who had sent a basket of late pears and a letter so cautious it seemed to curtsy between every line. The second invitation went to Lady Bracken, a widowed baronet's mother, from 4 miles beyond the South Road, respectable, observant, and too old to be easily managed by gossip. 2 more went to county ladies, whose husbands had business with the estate, and whose names Mrs. Harrow recommended only after a silence long enough to count as moral struggle. The 5th was not an invitation, but a request for Mr. Tobias Quennell to attend if his journey from York allowed, bringing any reply from the former conservation firm's records and the estate correspondence he had promised to examine. Adeline did not write the word musicale. She did not write reception. She did not write entertainment. She wrote afternoon tea and a brief viewing of the restored morning room, with household music, if the instrument permits. When Roland found the stack of folded cards on the tray by the door, his face changed as if the cards had been loaded pistols. You are receiving callers. Adeline sanded the last card, waited until the grain settled, then lifted her eyes. I am inviting 4 ladies to drink tea in a room that has chairs. Hollowmere does not receive, so I have observed. He looked toward the morning room, where Mrs. Vale's small pianoforte had been opened to daylight, and no further. It has not received for years. Then it has spent years practicing failure. Adeline. The name was low, almost a warning, yet it no longer sounded foreign in his mouth. She kept her hand beside the inkstand, not near the tuning fork. Since the morning he had returned it to her palm with permission. The object seemed to hold a second memory beneath the first. Her mother's touch remained, but now so did the careful warmth of his fingers, closing hers around it, and releasing before tenderness could become claim. "Roland," she answered, equally quiet. His gaze touched her face, and the warning shifted into something more difficult. "You think opening a room will mend what happened here? No, I think leaving every door shut has not done so." He turned away, then turned back, as if the room itself had refused to let him retreat. "People will talk. They already do. At present, they talk into emptiness. I prefer they speak where I may hear them. You do not know these families. Then I had better begin with tea rather than a ball." The smallest line appeared at the corner of his mouth. It vanished quickly, but Adeline had seen it. So had he perhaps, for he looked faintly irritated by his own near amusement. "Lady Euphemia will hear of it." Lady Euphemia hears many things before they are said. Roland's expression hardened not against her, against the truth in the sentence. Lady Euphemia had remained at Hollowmere for one night as commanded, then contrived to stay 2 more through rain, a lame carriage horse, and concern so delicate that one could not strike it without appearing cruel. She had left at last with perfect courtesy and a promise to help prepare the county for the Duchess's good intentions, a phrase Adeline had copied into her notebook under possible threats. "This is not a challenge to her," Adeline said. "It is not even about her. Everything becomes about her if the room lets it. Then the room must learn better manners." He exhaled once, almost a laugh and almost pain. "You speak as if Hollowmere is a child. No, children are usually less stubborn." He came closer to the desk, stopping at a distance that respected both propriety and the fragile new boundary between them. "What do you intend?" "Tea, the West morning room. Mrs. Vale will play one simple piece if the instrument holds. I will show the ladies the chairs uncovered, the curtains repaired, and the list of tapestries once held in the long gallery. Not the selvage." Roland's eyes sharpened. The torn selvage with the reversed falcon remained locked in Adeline's desk, folded in its muslin packet, marked with the date of discovery and the date it had been disturbed. The red wax fleck remained preserved in the folded handkerchief in his study, under Mrs. Harrow's earlier care, and now awaiting Quenelle. The false conservation note rested in Roland's locked drawer, copied once by Adeline's hand. Each piece had its place. "You will not show the selvage?" he asked. "No, not until we understand it." "Good. But I will ask whether anyone remembers the falcon returns at dawn." Roland went still. "Why that one?" "Because Euphemia remembered it incorrectly. Because the reversed falcon does not match the Wycliffe crest. Because every person in this house becomes careful when the eastern wall is mentioned, and because if a lie has been told for years, it may flinch at its own name." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is dangerous reasoning." "It is reasoning. Danger belongs to whoever fears it." Before he could answer, Mrs. Vale appeared at the door with a roll of old music tied in faded tape. She bobbed a nervous curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Grace. Your Grace. I found the program books you asked for. They were in the lower cabinet, beneath some old sermon sheets." Adeline stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale." The old woman carried the papers as if they might bruise. Adeline untied the tape on the desk. The upper programs listed hymn practice, Christmas charity pieces and one harvest supper from years before. Beneath them lay a thinner card, cream paper browned at the edges, a private evening of music at Hollowmere. The date was more than a decade past. Eleanor Wycliffe's name appeared in a neat hand beside two piano pieces. Below the programme, written in pencil, was a note about the arrangement of the room. Pianoforte beneath the falcon returns at dawn. Adeline felt the air gather around the words. Roland reached for the card, then stopped before touching it. "May I?" he asked. The question was rougher than the one he had used with the tuning fork. Adeline gave him the programme. His thumb rested just below Eleanor's name, not over it. "She wrote this," he said. "The title, the seating note. She never trusted servants to place chairs without an argument. She said chairs were the politics of a room made visible." Mrs. Vale gave the faintest watery smile. "Lady Eleanor did say that, Your Grace." Roland looked at the old music maid, as if he had forgotten she could carry memories not authorized by him. "You remember the evening?" Mrs. Vale's smile disappeared. "Parts of it, Your Grace." "Which parts?" Adeline asked gently. The old woman glanced at Roland. He nodded once. Not command, permission. "The tapestry was there then," Mrs. Vale said. "The falcon one. It hung behind the pianoforte, bright as harvest. Lady Eleanor was pleased by it. She said the bird looked as if it meant to leave the wall." Roland looked down at the card. "It was removed after." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Vale folded her hands. "After everything. No one asked after what? Not yet." The afternoon chosen for the tea came 3 days later, mild enough to open the west windows for an hour and let the old room trade dust for air. Adeline wore soft grey silk with no jewels beyond her wedding ring and her mother's small pearl pins. She wanted no one to mistake the gathering for display. Mrs. Harrow arranged the tea tray with scones, seed cake, and thin sandwiches cut with severe accuracy. Thomas carried chairs as if chair legs had become matters of state. Roland had objected to none of it after the programme was found, but neither had he promised attendance. Adeline discovered whether he would come only when the first carriage wheels sounded below and he entered the morning room. In a dark coat, expression controlled, eyes taking in every detail. "You need not remain," she said under cover of Mrs. Harrow adjusting cups. "I know." "Then why do you?" "Because if they come to weigh my wife, they will not find the scale unattended." The words should have sounded possessive. They did not. There was protection in them, yes, but also a strange humility, as if he knew she had not asked to be weighed by anyone, including him. Adeline's hand tightened briefly around the back of a chair. "Then stand where they can see you listening." His gaze met hers. "Not speaking, not unless speech becomes necessary. A hard discipline for a duke, a useful one for a husband." He absorbed that quietly. Then Mrs. Alton was announced, followed by Lady Bracken and the 2 county ladies. The room filled with silk rustle, polite surprise, and the careful glances of women who had expected decay and found instead restraint, fresh air, and a duchess who neither apologized for the room nor boasted of it. Tea began safely. That alone felt like victory. Lady Bracken admired the repaired curtain. Mrs. Alton praised Mrs. Vale's playing before Mrs. Vale had touched a key. One of the younger ladies asked whether the long gallery might also be opened. Adeline answered, "In time, when its history can be shown accurately." Roland looked toward her then, and she felt his attention like a hand offered but not extended. Mrs. Vale sat at the pianoforte. The first note came out thin, but true enough to live. Adeline stood beside the instrument while the melody gathered itself. Roland remained near the mantel, He did not flinch, not visibly. When the piece ended, he said so quietly that only Adeline heard, "That is the first sound in this house I have not wished to stop." She did not look at him at once. If she had, something unguarded might have answered too soon. Then perhaps Hollowmere has begun with the right note. The room moved on around them. Cups returned to saucers. Mrs. Alton asked about the vicar's charities. Lady Bracken asked whether the Duchess intended a larger county call. Then, near the door, a woman's voice murmured to another, not softly enough. Curious. That invitation card looked very like the ones sent before Lady Eleanor's last music evening. Adeline's smile did not change. Roland's hand closed once at his side. Across the room, one of the footmen glanced toward the corridor. And, from the hall beyond, though she had not been invited, Lady Euphemia Staveley's voice floated in smooth and bright. "How fortunate I arrived in time. I should hate to miss Hollowmere learning to sing again." Lady Euphemia entered the morning room as if the uninvited always arrived by Providence. She wore pale lavender silk, trimmed with black braid. A morning colour softened just enough to flatter rather than grieve, and behind her came two ladies Adeline had not invited. Mrs. Alton's smile faltered. Lady Bracken's eyes narrowed with the weary intelligence of a woman who had watched polite ambushes for 40 years. Roland did not move from the mantel, but the temperature of his attention changed. "Lady Euphemia," he said, "I understood you had returned to Staveley Lodge." "I had," she replied, removing her gloves finger by finger. Then Lady Morpeth and Mrs. Dane begged to see whether the rumours of Hollowmere's revival were true. I couldn't possibly deny such innocent curiosity. Adeline glanced at the two added guests and saw at once that their curiosity had been fed before arrival. Their gazes went not to the tea-tray or mended curtains, but to the pianoforte, the invitation cards on the side table, and the closed door toward the long gallery. Someone had prepared them to look for offence. "How fortunate," Adeline said. That innocent curiosity arrived after tea was poured, but before the house was condemned. Lady Bracken coughed into her napkin, whether from amusement or cake was unclear. Euphemia smiled. "My dear Duchess, no one wishes to condemn you. We are only delighted that you have taken such energetic possession of Hollowmere." Possession. The word touched the room like ink spilled on silk. Adeline set her cup down. "I hope to deserve responsibility before I am accused of possession." "Accused?" Mrs. Dane repeated, too quickly. "Surely no one accuses your grace." Roland looked toward the woman and she remembered her spoon. Euphemia moved to the pianoforte and rested one hand on its lid. "I was merely thinking how touching it is. A young bride, newly installed, discovering old rooms, old music, old ornaments. It must be tempting to imagine the past has waited especially for one's arrival." "The past rarely waits," Adeline said. "It leaves marks, and sometimes bills," Fenman said from the doorway. No servant had announced him. He bowed with a troubled expression, so perfectly arranged that Adeline knew the scene had reached its rehearsed portion. He carried a folded paper packet and a narrow printed sheet. Roland's voice sharpened. "Mr. Fenman, you were not summoned. Forgive me, Your Grace. A matter has arisen that cannot honourably wait." Adeline felt the room lean toward him. Euphemia lowered her eyes, but not before satisfaction crossed them. Fenman stepped forward. A messenger arrived from York. "There appears to be confusion regarding one of the Wycliffe tapestries." He placed the printed sheet on the tea table. "Lot 47. Wycliffe Falcon Tapestry, sold by order of Her Grace the Duchess of Merrowden." Silence fell with such force that the weak pianoforte string hummed faintly in sympathy. Mrs. Alton stared at the page. Mrs. Dane made a small sound of horror. Adeline did not reach for the sheet. Not yet. "Sold by whose order?" she asked. "By order of her grace," Fenman repeated, with regret polished thin. "The auction catalogue is unfortunately explicit." Euphemia stepped back from the instrument. "There must be some mistake." Her voice trembled beautifully. The Duchess would never sell a family tapestry while inviting guests to admire her restoration. Adeline looked at Roland. He was staring at the catalogue, not at her. That hurt more than accusation. The sheet was within his reach. He lifted it. His face gave nothing away, but his hand had gone still in the way it did when feeling approached too closely. Fenman unfolded the packet. "There is also an instruction, copied for the sale room records, initialed A.P. He offered it to Roland, who did not take it at once. "A.P.," Mrs. Dane whispered. "Adeline Penrose," said Lady Morpeth, as if names became gilt when spoken by another mouth. "Adeline Wycliffe," Adeline corrected. Her voice remained steady. Inside, something had gone very cold. She reached for the copied instruction herself. Roland's hand moved, as if to stop her, then halted before command became contact. Good, she thought distantly. He had learned one thing. She read the page. The initials were almost hers. Not quite. The A curved properly, copied from the cards she had sent. The P followed too closely, without the small space her pen always left after lifting. A copied hand, not a written one. "This is not my writing." Euphemia's eyes filled with pity. "My dear, of course you must say so." Roland turned on her. "Do not." The single command silenced her smile, but not the damage. Fenman bowed his head. "No one wishes to distress her grace. Yet the timing is unfortunate. Her grace has been examining the long gallery, asking after the falcon returns at dawn, and now the catalogue suggests one such piece has entered the market." When? Adeline asked. "I beg your pardon." "When was lot 47 entered for sale?" Fenman glanced at the catalogue. "The date is not shown on this page. How convenient." "Duchess," Euphemia murmured, "anger won't help." "I am not angry. I am requesting the missing half of a fact." Roland finally looked at her. There was conflict in his eyes. Not belief, not disbelief. A miserable, suspended caution. The sale room can be asked. "It should have been asked before this paper was brought into my morning room." Fenman's expression tightened. "I brought it to prevent rumor from outrunning the truth." "No," Adeline said. "You brought it before truth could put on its shoes." Lady Bracken's mouth moved again, but she hid it behind her tea. At that exact moment, Mrs. Vale, who had remained at the pianoforte in pale distress, shifted her foot. A sharp metallic snap rang through the room. One of the instrument wires broke beneath the lid with a jolt loud enough to make Mrs. Alton cry out. Thomas rushed forward and stopped, afraid to touch anything. Mrs. Dane rose from her chair as if music itself had attacked her. Euphemia pressed a hand to her breast. "This is precisely what I feared. The house is being forced before it is ready." Adeline looked at the instrument, then at Fenman. The timing was too perfect. The note too dramatic. The accusation had needed a sound, and now it had one. Roland stepped toward the pianoforte, opened the lid enough to look inside, and closed it again. "No one touches it until it is examined." "Examined?" Euphemia said. "Roland, surely you don't think the poor instrument conspired?" "In this house, I am beginning to think very little happens alone." For 1 second, Adeline's breath eased. Then he turned toward the guests, and the fragile ease shattered. "Until this matter is resolved, there will be no further music gatherings at Hollowmere." The words struck quietly. That made them worse. No one gasped. No one needed to. The old silence stepped back into the room as if invited by its master. Adeline looked at him, waiting for the rest, waiting for something that would say he understood what he had just done. He had not called her thief. He had stopped Euphemia's insult. He had preserved evidence, but he had also closed the door she had opened before the people who had come to see whether she had any right to open it. For the dignity of the house, Euphemia said softly. Roland's face hardened. You will not interpret me? Of course. Yet the interpretation had already landed. Adeline placed the copied instruction on the table. I would like the catalogue page, the alleged instruction, and the names of every person who handled both before they arrived here. Fenman hesitated. The documents are estate concerns. I am the Duchess of this estate. Naturally, Your Grace, but in matters of irregularity, His Grace may prefer. His Grace may prefer many things, Adeline said. Truth should not have to wait upon preference. Roland's gaze flickered. The papers will remain with me until Quesnel arrives. It was reasonable. It was also not trust. Adeline inclined her head. As you wish. She turned to the guests. Ladies, I regret the disturbance. Mrs. Harrow will see that your carriages are called. Mrs. Alton looked near tears. Lady Bracken rose slowly and gave Adeline a curtsy deeper than before. It was small, but it was not nothing. The others followed with varying degrees of stiffness and relief. Euphemia lingered until Roland looked at her. Then she left too, carrying concern out of the room like a perfume that had begun to sour. When the door closed, only Roland, Adeline, the broken pianoforte, and the documents remained. He took one step toward her. Adeline. His voice had changed. Too late. Not false, but too late. Do not. He stopped immediately. I did not accuse you. No, you quieted me. Pain crossed his face. There are guests, papers, a public suggestion of sale. I have to contain the scandal. You contained the music. I contained the occasion. That is a prettier phrase for the same lock. He flinched at the word. She went to the pianoforte, removed the small key from its place beside the music stand, and laid it on the closed lid. The sound was soft, final. I will not play a room that can be silenced by forged ink, and a frightened duke. His eyes darkened. Frightened? Yes. Her voice remained low. Not of me, not even of scandal, of hearing something before the proof has given you permission. She turned toward the door. The catalogue page has a buyer's mark near the lower corner. H.F., you may wish to ask Mr. Horace Fenman why his initials appear beside a tapestry supposedly sold by my order. Roland looked down sharply. He had not seen it. She had. That mattered, but not enough. He reached toward her, then remembered himself. His hand fell. Adeline saw the restraint and honored it by leaving before grief made her soften. At the threshold, she looked back once. Do not quiet me and call it protection. Then she walked out of the morning room without waiting to be dismissed, while behind her the broken pianoforte held its silence like an accusation no one could tune away. Adeline did not leave Hollowmere after the accusation, and that unsettled the house more than tears would have done. By breakfast the next morning, the west sitting room had become hers, in a way the bridal apartments had never been. She did not announce a retreat. She simply moved her writing desk there, asked Mrs. Harrow for a fresh lock on the drawer, and requested that all household messages intended for the Duchess be brought to that room and no other. The pianoforte key remained where she had placed it on the closed instrument in the morning room. The torn selvage with the reversed falcon remained folded in its muslin packet inside her desk. with its dates recorded. The false conservation note and the catalogue page lay in Roland's locked study, awaiting Mr. Quesnel. The wax fleck was still preserved in the folded handkerchief. Each object had its place. Each place mattered. If a lie wished to spread through Hollowmere, it would have to step around order. She dressed in dark blue wool, not mourning, not defiance, simply something strong enough to endure ink and cold corridors. Mrs. Harrow arrived with tea and looked at the sealed writing case, the sharpened pencils, the invitation cards stacked for comparison, and the small pile of household papers. "Your Grace, would you prefer not to see anyone today?" "I would prefer," Adeline said, "that anyone who believes I am broken be disappointed promptly." The housekeeper's mouth tightened with emotion she did not permit to. "Rise. There is talk below stairs. There is always talk below stairs. The only question is whether it has been fed truth or scraps. Some are frightened. Of me? For you." That nearly undid her, not because the words were grand, but because they were not. Concern, when not used as a leash, had a quiet face. Adeline poured tea with steady hands. "Then tell them I am wounded. I am not erased." Mrs. Harrow bowed her head. "Yes, Your Grace." When she left, Adeline began with the invitations. She laid her own card beside the copied instruction. Fenman had shown the room, as much as memory allowed, then took a clean sheet and reproduced her initials 3 times. The A in the false instruction had been close, almost elegantly close, but the spacing before the P betrayed the copyist. Whoever had forged it had traced shape, not movement. A handwriting formed by a hand remembers where it breathes. A copyist remembers only where ink must lie. She wrote 1 letter to the York auctioneer requesting the full date, consignor, agent, buyer's mark, and clerk's record for lot of 47. She wrote another to a textile conservator named in Mrs. Vale's old notes, asking whether a reversed falcon selvage might indicate a copy made from the back of a design. A 3rd letter went to Mr. Quesnel, requesting immediate comparison between the auction mark HF, the false instruction, the conservation note, and Fenman's official estate hand. She sealed each carefully. No accusation. Facts only. Facts could pass through doors where outrage would be turned away. Near noon, Mrs. Vale came to the west sitting room, leaning on a dark cane, with a face full of nerves and resolve. Your Grace asked whether I ever mended the gallery hangings. Adeline rose at once and offered the chair nearest the fire. I did. Sit, Mrs. Vale. This is not an examination. The old woman lowered herself slowly. It feels like one, begging pardon. Then we shall call it remembering. Mrs. Vale's fingers twisted in her lap. The Wycliffe falcon was never reversed, not on the true work. The old weavers were proud of that bird. It faced the chapel end on the Falcon Returns at dawn, same as His Grace said. But if someone copied a border from the wrong side or traced it through, it could turn. A copy, Adeline said. A poor one, not poor. Quick, made by someone who wanted enough likeness for a stranger, not enough truth for family. Adeline unlocked the drawer and removed the muslin packet. She did not hand the selvage over at once. May I show you? Mrs. Vale looked grateful for the question. Yes, Your Grace. Adeline unfolded the muslin. The old seamstress leaned close, then pressed one trembling hand to her mouth. That is not from the original. You are certain? The red is wrong, too sharp. The gold thread is newer. The edge finish is not Wycliffe work. Could it have come from a copy sold in York? It could, Mrs. Vale swallowed, or from a copy made to pretend the original was gone. The room seemed to contract around them. Adeline refolded the selvage and wrote Mrs. Vale's statement in her notebook, marking the time and wording. Who would have known enough to arrange such a copy? A steward with the inventory, a lady who had seen the wall often. Someone who knew his grace would not look closely after Lady Eleanor. Lady Euphemia. The name came out quietly. Mrs. Vale looked toward the door before answering. She sat beside that wall on Lady Eleanor's last music evening. I remember because Lady Eleanor said chairs were the politics of a room, and Lady Euphemia laughed as though it were foolish. Was Mr. Fenman present? In and out, always in and out when he wanted not to be seen. A sound came from the corridor, not a footstep fleeing, a footstep stopping. Adeline held up one hand for Mrs. Vale to remain seated, then crossed to the door and opened it. Roland stood outside, hatless, one hand at his side, the other holding nothing. That mattered. No papers, no command. I did not enter, he said. No, Adeline replied. You did not. He looked past her only far enough to see Mrs. Vale safe in the chair. Then his gaze returned to Adeline. I have placed a groom near the west passage. Lady Euphemia will not be admitted here unless you allow it. My evidence is not yours to guard without my consent. Pain moved across his face, quick and deserved. You are right. The admission, made without defense, settled between them. Then, why did you place him there? Because last night one of the maids saw Fenman near the back stair after the household had gone down. Because someone entered your room once. Because I was wrong to quiet the music. But I would be more wrong to let the same hand reach your desk again while I learn how to repair it. She wanted to reject the protection because the wound was fresh. She could not reject the reason. He may remain in the passage, she said. He may not stop Mrs. Vale, Mrs. Harrow, Thomas, or any messenger I send. Agreed. And you may not decide which truth is safe for me. His hand flexed once. Agreed. The word came rougher than the first. It cost him more. She saw that. She did not soften because of it. Softening before repair was how women were trained to bury injury and call the ground peaceful. I have written to York, she said. So have I. On whose authority? He absorbed the question. On mine, requesting records, not silencing yours. He drew a folded note from inside his coat and held it out without stepping across the threshold. A copy. You may read it or burn it as you choose. I don't burn evidence. No, he said quietly. I am beginning to understand that. She took the note. Their fingers did not touch. That restraint was a kind of conversation. He looked toward the desk where her invitation cards beside her handwriting samples. You saw the spacing? Yes, I did not know. He accepted that too. I should have, yes. The corridor held no music, no witnesses, except Mrs. Vale, whose gaze remained modestly lowered. Yet this was more intimate than the moment with the tuning fork had been, because it contained no beauty to hide inside. Only failure, boundary, and the difficult shape of respect after harm. Adeline, he said, I won't ask you to trust what I haven't earned. Good. His mouth tightened, not with anger, but with something like grief at being answered fairly. Quennell is expected by tomorrow evening. Then, until tomorrow evening, I continue. Yes, he stepped back from the doorway. He did not ask permission to enter. He did not ask forgiveness in a hall where forgiveness would have been too easy to perform and too hard to mean. When he had gone, Mrs. Vale released a long breath. His grace is changing. Adeline returned to the desk and folded Roland's copied letter into her evidence book. No, she said. He is choosing not to remain the same. That is different. Late that afternoon, the first reply came from York, by a rider whose horse steamed in the courtyard. The envelope bore the auctioneer's mark and smelled faintly of rain. Adeline opened it with Mrs. Harrow present and Thomas waiting by the door as witness. Lot 47, the clerk wrote, had been entered 3 years earlier, 3 years before Adeline Penrose had ever stood in Hollowmere Chapel, 3 years before anyone in Yorkshire could have called her Duchess of Merrowden. At the bottom of the page, beneath the sale notation, stood the buyer's mark again. H.F. Adeline placed the letter beside the muslin packet. Outside, the west corridor remained guarded. Inside, the room felt neither safe nor warm, but it was hers. And for the first time since the accusation, the lie had acquired a date. The sealed music room announced itself not with a key, but with dust. On the 5th week of Adeline's residence at Hollowmere, after the York letter had placed Lot 47 3 years safely beyond her reach, and therefore beyond her guilt, the castle seemed to grow more watchful. Fenman moved through corridors with the air of a man attending to duties that suddenly required witnesses. Lady Euphemia claimed a headache and asked Mrs. Harrow whether the south road to Staveley Lodge was passable, though no carriage had yet been ordered. Mr. Quinnell was expected again by evening, delayed by business with the auctioneer's clerk, and Roland had spent the morning in his study, comparing the copied instruction against Fenman's estate hand with an intensity that made no sound. Adeline did not disturb him. She had learned that some men needed solitude not to avoid truth, but to approach it without the humiliation of being seen afraid. She took Mrs. Vale instead to the West Passage cabinet, where the old program books had been found, meaning only to search for seating plans from Eleanor's final music evening. The cabinet smelled of beeswax and long-closed paper. Its lower shelf stuck when Thomas pulled it forward, and a thin rain of grey dust slipped down behind the wood. Mrs. Vale, who had been watching from a chair, leaned sharply toward it. That shelf was never so deep. Adeline looked at Thomas. "Can it be drawn farther?" "Yes, your grace, if I don't break it." "Then do not break it." He worked carefully, tongue caught between his teeth, until the shelf shifted with a small wooden complaint. Behind it lay a narrow cavity, and inside the cavity lay a key wrapped in browned paper and tied with a strip of black thread. Not a grand key, not polished. It was small, iron, and practical, with a label half rubbed away. Music room. Mrs. Vale made a sound that was almost prayer. Adeline did not reach for it at once. The lesson of the selvage held. Objects must be seen where they were found before they were moved. "Thomas, fetch Mrs. Harrow. Ask her to bring paper and sealing wax." "Mrs. Vale, did you know this was here?" The old woman shook her head. "No, your grace, but Lady Eleanor used that cabinet. She kept programs where Mr. Fenman would think them too dull to steal. Adeline marked the place, the time, and the witnesses. Only then did she lift the key. It felt colder than the room. "Send for his grace," she said. "Tell him I have found a door that belongs first to his grief, and only then to my evidence." Roland came without delay. He arrived at the West Passage with no cane, no gloves, and no attempt to make his haste invisible. When Adeline held out the key, he looked at it as if she had offered him a bone from a grave. "Where?" he asked. "Behind the program shelf. You did not open the room?" "No." His gaze rose to hers. The gratitude in it was not soft. It was stunned, as if he had expected everyone, sooner or later, to trespass upon pain once they found the latch. "Why? Because this room is your grief before it is my evidence." He drew a breath that did not quite steady him. "And if my grief has been used to hide evidence, then we open it together." Mrs. Harrow and Thomas remained at a distance. Mrs. Vale held the program books against her chest. Roland looked toward the eastern corridor. where the carved falcon watched above the doors that had not been opened in years. No one else enters until I say. Adeline's expression did not change until we say. His eyes flicked to her. A month earlier, that correction might have met stone. Now it met a man who had begun to understand the shape of his own wrongs. Until we say, he repeated. The music room door stood beyond a narrow passage beside the long gallery, its panels dark with age and its brass handle dulled almost black. Roland fitted the key with difficulty. For one awful moment, Adeline thought it would not turn. Then the lock yielded. The smell of old paper, dust, lavender sachet, and dead candle wax breathed out. Roland did not cross the threshold. Not immediately. Adeline waited beside him. The room beyond was smaller than she expected, more intimate than grand. A square pianoforte stood under a sheet. Music shelves lined one wall. A harp frame leaned in the corner without strings. On the mantel stood 2 empty candlesticks and a porcelain shepherdess whose painted face had cracked down one cheek. Nothing had been violently ruined. That was somehow worse. The room had been stopped mid-breath and forbidden to finish it. Eleanor's room, Roland said. Not by title, by conquest. Adeline looked at him. She conquered rooms regularly. A ghost of a smile crossed his mouth and broke before it could live. She said if a house resisted music, it was because too many men had been allowed to speak first. Mrs. Vale, from the passage, whispered. She did say that, Your Grace. Roland closed his eyes briefly. Yes, she did. They entered together. Adeline did not touch the instruments. Roland moved first to the covered pianoforte, then stopped with his hand above the sheet. The night before she left, we argued here. His voice was even only because he forced it to be. She wanted another music evening. I said the house was not a public theatre. She said I had mistaken silence for dignity. She had found something, or thought she had. Papers, a sketch, some nonsense about a tapestry being copied. I told her she was dramatic, careless, determined to make every feeling audible. Adeline's chest tightened, but she did not interrupt. It rained that night. She left in anger to visit our aunt near Ripon. The fever came after the journey. Within a week she was dead, and I had preserved the last silence I ever imposed on her, as if it were respect. The confession filled the room more completely than music could have done. Adeline understood then why he had forbidden sound. Not because he hated it, but because the last living version of his sister had spoken through it, and he had refused to hear. Roland, she said quietly, you were wrong. That doesn't mean you killed her. He turned toward her with such pain in his face that she nearly stepped back. You cannot know that. No, but I know guilt often wants to be powerful because power feels less helpless than grief. He stared at her. Who taught you to say such things? A lonely childhood. A mother who died slowly. A father who preferred daughters useful and quiet. You were not quiet. I was, for years. She looked around the stopped room. That is why I recognize the cost. Roland looked away first, not in dismissal, in survival. Adeline moved to the writing desk beneath the window. Its drawer was swollen but not locked. Inside lay brittle scraps of music paper, a pencil worn nearly flat, and a narrow ledger bound in green cloth. Eleanor's hand ran across the first page in quick, impatient lines. Adeline did not read aloud until Roland stood beside her. Eleanor's music ledger, she said. Shall I? He nodded once. The early pages held titles, seating notes, small complaints about singers who arrived late, and cousins who stood where they blocked candlelight. Then, midway through, the tone changed. The falcon returns at dawn is not in the gallery because of moths. Horace says Euphemia can arrange the sale quietly. He thinks Roland will not look if the room is made painful enough. A later line had been pressed so hard the pencil nearly tore the paper. Euphemia says Horace can arrange the sale quietly. Roland must never know before the music-hale. Roland's hand struck the edge of the desk and stopped there. He did not speak. Adeline read the line again silently, then closed the ledger enough to protect the page. "This connects them," she said. "It does not yet prove the present accusation." No, his voice was raw, but it proves she was not dramatic. She was listening, and I told her to stop making noise. The words broke something in him then. Not loudly. He bowed his head, and the man who had given orders to silence a castle stood in the room his sister had left behind, unable to command his own breath. Adeline set the ledger down. She did not reach for him, as comfort might be claimed too quickly by a man accustomed to being obeyed. Instead, she asked, "May I stay near you?" He turned his face toward her, and in the quiet, the question seemed to undo him more than any embrace, taken without permission, could have done. "Yes," he said. "Please." She stepped close and placed her arms around him with the restraint of a woman offering shelter, not possession. For a moment he remained rigid, then his hands came to her back, careful, uncertain, holding only as much as she had offered. His cheek lowered near her hair, but did not press there. They stood in Eleanor's stopped room, among dust and music, and proof that grief had been made useful to thieves. When Adeline loosened her hold, he released her at once. His eyes were bright, but he did not hide them. "I made silence holy," he said, "because it was easier than admitting I had been wrong." "Then we will not make noise for its own sake," Adeline replied. "We will make truth audible." He looked at the ledger. "Euphemia will try to leave." "Then let her. A person who flees too neatly often leaves a pattern behind." At the desk, Adeline turned one more page with care. Something slipped from the fold and landed on the blotter. A pressed thread, red and gold. The same colors as the selvage in her locked packet. Roland stared at it, as if the wall itself had begun speaking at last. Miss Quennell arrived at Hollowmere near dusk, with mud on his boots, rain on his hat, and the expression of a man who had brought paper sharp enough to cut through a house. He was shown first to Roland's study, but Adeline did not wait to be summoned like a dependent witness whose value began only when men opened a door. She brought Eleanor's green music ledger, the muslin packet containing the reversed selvage, her copied notes on the false conservation paper, and the York auctioneer's reply, showing that Lot 47 had been entered 3 years before her marriage. Mrs. Harrow followed with the folded handkerchief that held the red wax fleck from the fallen gallery rod. Roland looked up when Adeline entered. The room had changed since she first saw it, not in furniture, in allegiance. The Duke's great desk still stood like a judgment bench, and the family portraits still watched from the walls. But tonight the evidence did not lie hidden in separate drawers. It lay in the open, placed by her hand, his hand, and the solicitor's hand together. Quennell rose at once. "Your Grace." He bowed to Roland, then to Adeline with equal gravity. "Duchess." Adeline set Eleanor's ledger on the desk. "Mr. Quennell, before we begin, I should like it noted that this book was found in the sealed music room this afternoon, in the presence of His Grace, Mrs. Harrow, Mrs. Vale, and Thomas, the under-footman. It has not been removed from my sight except when His Grace held it in the room beside me." Roland's eyes moved to her. He did not interrupt. "That was something." "Noted," Quennell said, drawing out his notebook. "And the thread?" "Found pressed inside the ledger. It remains between those pages." Good. Quenelle removed his spectacles and wiped them carefully. Then I can add what I obtained in York. Lot 47 was entered for sale not 3 weeks ago, as Lady Euphemia's display suggested, but 3 years ago last March. The catalogue page shown at the T was copied without the original dateline. Roland's mouth hardened. Who authorized the entry? The agent is recorded as HF. That mark also appears in the buyer's column. A man selling to himself, Adeline said. Or pretending to, Quenelle replied. The auctioneer's clerk remembers the oddity because the tapestry was listed as Wycliffe work, but withdrawn before the public sale. A private buyer inspected a copy, paid a deposit, then refused completion when the weave was questioned. Roland looked toward the muslin packet, a copy with a reversed falcon. So the textile conservator believes. Quenelle produced a second packet. Mrs. Ellery of York sent this note by my hand. She says, the red is an aniline shade, too recent for the original tapestry period, and the gold thread is machine-twisted in a manner inconsistent with old Wycliffe work. The scrap Her Grace found is not from the original. It is from a modern copy made with haste and some knowledge of the design. Someone used a false tapestry to create a false sale, Adeline said, then used the old catalogue page to accuse me. Roland's hand rested on the desk. Because I had given them the perfect culprit, silence followed. It was not Hollowmere's old silence. That one had been defensive. This one waited for honesty to finish speaking. Adeline turned to him. You had given them a wife no one knew, a wife I had left alone. His voice was low. Quenelle's pen paused. Roland did not look away. And when they accused you before guests, I did not say what should have been said. You said you did not accuse me. Yes, because I was trying to keep my hands clean while I let silence do the damage. The words entered her slowly, not as apology yet, but as a door opening onto it. Quenelle lowered his eyes to his papers, giving them the courtesy of pretending, not to hear what he could not avoid hearing. Adeline looked down at Eleanor's ledger. We still need the original tapestry. If it exists, Roland said. Mrs. Vale's words returned to Adeline. Too large to leave by the front doors, too old to disappear unnoticed, Mrs. Vale said. The falcon returns at dawn could not have been removed easily. If Fenman made a copy for the auction, perhaps he never moved the true work far at all. Roland's eyes sharpened. Quenelle leaned forward. Hidden on the estate. Hidden in the house, Adeline said. Everyone believed the gallery had been stripped. No one would look for a wall inside the walls. Before either man could answer, the study door opened without a knock. Fenman stood there, pale around the mouth, but dressed for travel beneath his steward's coat. His gloved hand closed around the handle of a dispatch case. Forgive me, Your Grace. I was informed Mr. Quenelle had arrived. Roland did not rise. You were not invited to enter. Fenman bowed. The matter concerns estate administration. I thought it proper to assist. Adeline's gaze went to the dispatch case. Are you traveling, Mr. Fenman? To York, Duchess. To gather clarifying records. How diligent. You always go to York when records become inconvenient. His eyes flickered. Quenelle set one document on the desk. Mr. Fenman, perhaps you can save yourself the journey. The auctioneer's clerk has already supplied the date. Lot 47 was entered 3 years ago. Fenman's face did not change enough for innocence. Then the copy shown at T was incomplete. Conveniently, Adeline said. Roland rose then. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You will leave the dispatch case. Your Grace, you heard me. Fenman's fingers tightened. For a moment, Adeline thought he might refuse outright. Instead, he bowed with brittle control and placed the case on a side chair. Naturally. I only meant to protect the estate from scandal. Roland looked at him with a contempt colder than anger. I have had enough protection that requires women to be made silent. Fenman's eyes moved to Adeline. There was hatred there at last, cleanly visible, because politeness had cracked, as your grace commands. When he left, Roland sent for a groom and gave instructions that Fenman was not to leave the estate without notice to the house. He also wrote to the magistrate's clerk in proper terms, requesting assistance should an estate officer attempt to remove papers under suspicion of fraud. No wild pursuit, no modern outrage, just authority finally turned toward truth rather than away from it. When the door closed again, Adeline opened Fenman's dispatch case with Quenelle as witness. Inside lay copied correspondence, a small packet of receipts, and a torn draft of a note addressed in Lady Euphemia's slanted hand. Only one line remained complete. If the Duchess insists on restoring the room, let the old sale become hers. Roland read it once and went very still. She knew enough, Quenelle said. Not enough for final proof of the old theft, but enough to show intent in the present accusation. Adeline should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt tired in a place deeper than thought. She will write to the county ladies tonight. She already has, Roland said. A groom intercepted no letter, but Mrs. Harrow reports her maid asked twice about the South Post. He came around the desk slowly and stopped with the tuning fork between them where Adeline had placed it beside the ledger. Adeline. She looked at him because he used her name not as persuasion, but as responsibility. I owe you more than a defense. Quenelle closed his notebook. I will examine the receipts in the adjoining room, Your Grace. Neither of them thanked him. They were too fixed upon the precipice between them. When the door shut, Roland placed one hand flat on the desk, not near hers. I doubted action. I told myself I was waiting for proof. I told myself I was preventing gossip from worsening. The truth is uglier. Silence was familiar to me. I knew how to command it. I did not know how to stand inside your pain while other people watched. Adeline's eyes burned, but she did not look away. You made me alone in a room full of guests. Yes, the word struck him as he said it. I did, and I am sorry. Not because the evidence is turning in your favor. I should have been sorry before it became comfortable. That was the apology she had not known how badly she needed. Not polished, not defensive, not asking to be rewarded. She touched the tuning fork with 2 fingers. I cannot give you trust because you have named the wound. I know. You cannot protect me by arranging the room so I never have to speak. I know that too. Do you? He swallowed. I am learning it too late. The honesty gentled something in her without weakening the boundary. She looked at his hand on the desk, then placed the tuning fork between them fully. Then learn this. I will stand in the long gallery again. When the county hears the truth, I will speak first. His eyes closed briefly, opened. Yes, she laid her hand over his. He did not turn his palm. He waited, as he should have waited from the beginning. Only when her fingers remained did he slowly open his hand beneath hers. Adeline threaded her fingers through his, not tightly, not as forgiveness completed, but as permission given for this moment and no farther. His hand was warm, and this time its tremor did not come from music. You owe me nothing, he said. I know. Then why? She looked at the ledger, the false papers, the tuning fork, and finally at him, because I am angry, not empty. His breath left him quietly. For several moments they remained that way, hand in hand across the desk, where accusation had begun to turn into proof. Then a hurried knock came. Thomas entered, mud on his cuffs and excitement breaking through terror. Your Grace, Duchess. Beg pardon, but Mrs. Harrow sent me. Behind the old chapel organ screen, there's a strip of heavy woven stuff folded into the wall. Red and gold, Your Grace. And a bird's wing on it. Adeline's fingers tightened once around Roland's. Then she released him and stood. The comfort had lasted only long enough to become courage. Then, she said, the house has decided to answer. The chapel had always seemed smaller after dusk, but that evening it felt as though Hollowmere had been keeping a second nave hidden inside its walls. Adeline entered with Roland at her side, Mr. Quesnel behind them carrying his leather case, Mrs. Vale leaning on Thomas's offered arm, and Mrs. Harrow holding 2 lamps high enough to turn the carved pew ends into long shadows. The old organ screen stood at the rear of the chapel, dark oak carved with falcons, vines, and little blank-eyed saints, worn smooth by generations of dusting. It had been fixed to the stone so long that no one living in the house remembered seeing behind it. Yet between the lower panels, where Thomas had noticed a sliver of red and gold, something woven had been pressed into a gap that should have held only stone. Roland stopped before it, his face closed, but not empty. Adeline recognized the difference now. Empty was what he had given her on her wedding day. Closed was what he became when feeling came too near and demanded conduct. No one pulls it free, she said quietly. Not until Mr. Quesnel has seen the position. Roland glanced at her. There was no annoyance in it, only a grave acknowledgement. As Her Grace says. The title, spoken before servants and solicitor, did not feel like distance this time. It felt like recognition placed where everyone could hear. Quesnel knelt with difficulty, opened his case, and sketched the seam of the screen before touching anything. He noted the loose pin, the recent scratch beside the hinge, and the narrow wedge of fabric visible beneath the carved falcon. Mrs. Vale's breath trembled. "That colour," she whispered. "I have not seen it in this chapel since Lady Eleanor's last Easter." Roland's hand curled once at his side. Adeline saw it, but she did not take it. Part of her wished to. Another part knew he needed to remain standing under his own power before this particular door. Quesnel removed the loosened pin with a small tool. The lower panel shifted inward with a dry wooden sigh. Behind it lay folded canvas wrapping, old but not ancient, tied with brown tape and wedged between the screen and the stone recess. Thomas helped lower it to the floor, under Quesnel's direction, red-faced, with the honour and terror of touching ducal history. When the first fold opened, a falcon's wing flashed in the lamplight, worked in red, gold, and deep brown thread. Mrs. Vale covered her mouth. Roland inhaled as though the chapel air had struck him. "The falcon returns at dawn," he said. "Most of it," Quesnel added. "The edge is damaged." Adeline knelt, careful of her skirts, and laid the muslin packet beside the exposed lower border. Without allowing the scrap to touch the tapestry, the torn selvage found beneath the gallery bench matched the missing portion in shape, but not in age, not in thread quality, not in honesty. Beside the true work, the reversed falcon looked suddenly vulgar. Clever from a distance, false at the first patient look. "The copy was made from this damaged edge," Adeline said, "or from a tracing of it." Mrs. Vale nodded, tears running freely now. "The true falcon faces the chapel end. See there, Your Grace, wings raised. Lady Eleanor was so pleased by him," she said. "He looked as if he knew morning was a decision." Roland did not smile. His eyes were fixed on the tapestry with an expression Adeline could not bear to name for him. "She tried to tell me." "She did," Adeline said, "not gently enough to soften truth, but gently enough not to weaponize it. And now she is telling us again." Footsteps sounded at the chapel entrance. Euphemia stood there in a travelling cloak, her bonnet tied too hastily beneath her chin. For the first time since Adeline had met her, the lady's polish showed a crack at the edge. "What is this?" she asked. Roland turned. A question you hoped would stay folded. Euphemia looked from the tapestry to Mrs. Vale, then to Quenel's notebook. How dramatic! Eleanor would have adored this, all of you kneeling around a relic, as if cloth can absolve the living. Adeline rose. Cloth cannot absolve anyone. It can contradict a lie, or preserve one. Eleanor was sentimental. She hid things. She imagined offences when she was not admired. Roland moved one step forward, fury visible now, but Adeline touched his sleeve. Lightly, not to restrain him as one restrains danger, but to remind him of the promise he had made without yet knowing how badly he would need it. "Stand where they can see you listening." He stopped. The stillness cost him. Adeline felt it beneath her fingers before she removed them. "Lady Euphemia," she said, "if Eleanor hid the tapestry herself, why did a false auction page later appear without its dateline?" Euphemia's chin lifted. "Ask your steward." "We have." "Then ask your solicitor, since Hollowmere now apparently requires legal theatre before it can hang its own curtains." Quenel rose, brushing dust from his knees. "Lady Euphemia, the matter will indeed require witnesses. The evidence connects a false copy, a withdrawn York sale, Mr. Fenman's mark, and Lady Eleanor's ledger. Whether it reaches you depends, partly on what you choose to say before it is said for you." "I have nothing to say to a solicitor in a chapel." "Then say it tomorrow in the long gallery," Adeline replied. Euphemia looked at her with open dislike. It suited her better than concern. "You overestimate what a roomful of provincial ladies will understand." "No, I learned from you that rooms understand more than people intend." A stir came from the passage beyond the chapel. 2 grooms appeared with Fenman between them, his coat muddied at the hem, his hat gone, and his dispatch case no longer in his possession. Behind them stood the magistrate's clerk from the village, damp from the road and visibly uncomfortable at finding himself inside a ducal chapel after nightfall. Roland looked at Fenman. "You were told not to leave the estate." Fenman bowed, but his breathing was uneven. "I intended only to bring clarifying papers from York, Your Grace." "With no papers," Quenel said, "and a purse heavy enough for a journey much longer than York." Fenman's gaze darted to Euphemia. It was quick, not proof alone, but enough to make everyone in the chapel see where fear had first looked for shelter. Euphemia's face hardened. "Do not stare at me like a whipped dog, Mr. Fenman. If you have mismanaged estate property, you will answer for it." Something ugly passed across his face. "I have answered for it for years, my lady." Roland's voice cut through them both. "Enough. No more in corners. No more in chapels. No more behind screens." He turned to Adeline then, and before everyone present, he did not assume command. Where should the reckoning be held? The question changed the chapel more than any order could have done. Mrs. Harrow looked at Adeline as if she had heard a bell long broken begin to ring. Mrs. Vale straightened. Even Thomas seemed to grow an inch. Adeline looked toward the bundle on the chapel floor, the wounded tapestry that had not left the house after all. She thought of the long gallery on her wedding day, its bare walls, covered chairs, locked instrument, and servants watching a bride receive emptiness as if it were a settlement. Public wrong required more than private proof. "In the long gallery," she said, "not a study, not a solicitor's office. The room that displayed the absence must display the truth." Roland bowed his head once. "Then the gallery will hear you first." Euphemia gave a soft laugh. How touching. The Duke lets his Duchess perform. Adeline met her eyes. No, Lady Euphemia, the Duke will listen. You may find the difference instructive. By morning, invitations had gone out by mounted servant to every person who had witnessed Adeline's humiliation at the music tea, including Mrs. Alton, Lady Bracken, Lady Morpeth, and Mrs. Dane. The vicar was asked to attend as witness to the chapel discovery. Quesnel prepared the evidence order. The true tapestry, the false selvage, the auction copy, the clerk's date, the false conservation note, Eleanor's ledger, the red wax fleck, and Fenman's dispatch papers. Adeline slept little, but not from fear. Before dawn, she stood alone in the long gallery, while footmen carried in trestle tables and lamps under Mrs. Harrow's direction. The walls were still bare. The room was still wounded, yet now it no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. Roland entered as the first grey light reached the windows. He stopped several paces away. You should rest, so should you. I will when this is done, and if it does not end cleanly. Truth rarely does. He looked at the eastern wall. I used to think command could make the room safe. It made it quiet. Yes. The admission was immediate. She turned toward him, surprised by the lack of defense. His eyes were tired, but open. Tomorrow, he said. If I begin to speak before you have finished, stop me. I did last night. I know. You obeyed. I listened. Adeline stepped closer and, as she had in the chapel, touched his sleeve with 2 fingers. This time there was no crisis in the gesture, only a signal, a compact. Then do it again. His gaze lowered to her hand, then returned to her face. I will. She withdrew before the touch could become comfort they had not yet earned again. Outside, the first carriage wheels sounded on the drive. The same county that had heard her accused was coming to hear whether an empty room could be forced to remember its own truth. By the time the county guests entered the long gallery, the room no longer looked abandoned. It looked accused. Lamps stood along the bare walls where tapestries had once hung, their light falling over pale rectangles of stone, like evidence displayed by absence itself. At the eastern end, upon a long trestle table covered in white linen, Mr. Quesnel had arranged the proof in careful order. The false auction catalogue page, the complete clerk's copy showing the true date, the copied instruction with Adeline's initials, the false conservation note, the preserved red wax fleck, Eleanor's green music ledger, the modern reversed selvage, and behind them all, the damaged glory of The Falcon Returns at Dawn unrolled across a frame, so the true bird faced the chapel end, with its wings lifted toward an unseen morning. Adeline stood beside it in a gown of deep grey silk, her mother's pearl pins at her throat, and no other ornament. The ivory and ebony tuning fork lay in her reticule, close enough for her fingers to feel its outline through the fabric. Roland stood 3 paces to her right, not before her. That mattered. Mrs. Alton, Lady Bracken, Lady Morpeth, and Mrs. Dane took places near the chairs that had been set for them. The vicar stood with Mrs. Vale, who trembled but did not retreat. Mrs. Harrow remained near the doors, solemn as a churchwarden. Fenman stood under the watch of 2 estate grooms and the magistrate's clerk, his face drawn into the exhausted dignity of a man already preparing to claim. He had served under impossible conditions. Lady Euphemia came last. She wore black silk today, not lavender, and carried herself as though morning itself had asked her to represent it. Her gaze touched the tapestry, the documents, then Adeline. How theatrical, she said. No one laughed. Adeline rested one gloved hand near Eleanor's ledger. 3 weeks ago, in this room, I was brought as a bride into emptiness. Later, in the morning room, before several ladies present here, I was accused, by implication, of selling Wycliffe property while pretending to restore it. I asked then for dates, witnesses, and complete papers. We have them now. She looked to Quenelle. The solicitor bowed and lifted the catalogue page Euphemia had produced at the tea. This is the sheet shown before witnesses. It identifies Lot 47 as Wycliffe Falcon Tapestry and includes the phrase sold by order of Her Grace, the Duchess of Merrowden. It does not include the date line. He placed beside it the full clerk's copy. This is the complete page from the York auction rooms. Lot 47 was entered 3 years ago last March, before Lady Adeline Penrose became Duchess of Merrowden. A murmur moved through the guests. Mrs. Dane flushed. Lady Bracken looked directly at Euphemia. Adeline did not allow the room to drift. Mrs. Ellery's textile statement, if you please. Quenelle read the conservator's note. The red dye in the torn selvage was too recent. The gold thread was machine-twisted. The reversed falcon showed a copied design, not original Wycliffe work. Mrs. Vale stepped forward when Adeline inclined her head. Her voice shook, but it held. The true tapestry was never reversed. I mended a lower border when Lady Eleanor was alive. There, at the edge, you can see the brown repair threads I used. I kept the same twist in my work for 40 years. Quenelle lifted the selvage in its muslin packet and held it near the damaged portion of the tapestry without touching the two together. The scrap found by Her Grace beneath the eastern bench matches the damaged shape, but not the age, dye, or method. It is a false edge from a copy. Fenman's lips thinned. Old servants remember what powerful people need them to remember. Roland's head turned slowly. You will not insult Mrs. Vale in my house. Your Grace, I only mean that grief can distort recollection. Adeline opened Eleanor's ledger. Then let the dead be permitted her recollection. She read the line without embellishment. Euphemia says Horace can arrange the sale quietly. Roland must never know before the music-hale. The room stilled so completely that the lamps seemed loud. Euphemia gave a faint, wounded laugh. A private girl's scrawl. Eleanor was always dramatic. She imagined betrayals whenever affection did not arrange itself around her. Roland's hand moved, but Adeline's eyes touched his, and he stopped. She went on. The false conservation note claims the tapestries were destroyed 11 years ago by a York firm. Mr. Quenelle has confirmed that the named firm closed 6 years ago and could not have issued this paper on the date written. The watermark is also too recent. Quenelle placed Fenman's dispatch draft beside it, and this fragment, found in Mr. Fenman's travelling case, reads, "If the Duchess insists on restoring the room, let the old sale become hers." The handwriting is Lady Euphemia Staveley's. Euphemia's face sharpened. Half a sentence can be made to serve any malice. Then provide the other half, Adeline said. Euphemia's lips parted, then closed. Fenman looked at her, and the elegant agreement between them began to tear in public. My lady said no one would look backward, he said hoarsely. She said his Grace would rather cut off his hand than read Eleanor's old complaints. I arranged the copy to quiet a buyer who asked too much. I kept the original hidden because I had not yet decided whether it might be worth more later. Her ladyship knew. She knew enough. Euphemia turned on him. You were paid to manage estate disorder, not invent stories. Paid? Quenelle repeated. From whose account, Lady Euphemia? She said nothing. Fenman's shoulders sagged. She sent names, buyers, dealers. She said the gallery must remain painful. If it stayed painful, his Grace would never count what was missing. Roland stepped forward then, not in front of Adeline, but beside her, his voice was low, yet it carried to the far doors. "Enough, Horace Fenman. You are dismissed from service to House Wycliffe, Mr. Quesnel will place the evidence before the proper magistrate authority and pursue recovery of every estate property and sum you touched. You will not use my silence as your shelter again." Fenman bowed his head. The fight had left him. Roland turned to Euphemia. The room seemed to draw breath. "Lady Euphemia Staveley, you will leave Hollowmere today. You will not claim kinship, concern, grief, or old friendship as permission to enter any house under my authority. If any person present hears your version of this matter repeated as concern for my wife's nerves, let them remember that concern was the glove you wore over theft." Euphemia's composure cracked fully. "Your wife has made a shrine of Eleanor's disobedience and a spectacle of your family shame." Adeline answered before Roland could. "No, I turned a punishment into a home." The words settled into the very places where tapestries had once hung. Lady Bracken rose first and curtsied, not to Roland, but to Adeline. "Mrs." Alton followed, openly crying. Mrs. Dane could not meet Adeline's eyes. Roland faced the room. "And I owe her grace what should have been given before proof made decency easy. The first silence was mine. I gave my wife an empty castle, because emptiness asked nothing of me. When she brought warmth to it, I mistook courage for danger, because danger was the name I had given to being made to feel. She did not sell the walls. She made them speak. She did not dishonor my sister. She heard her when I would not." His voice broke on the final word. He did not hide it. For a man like Roland Wycliffe, that was its own public confession. After the guests withdrew in hushed groups, after Fenman was removed with the magistrate's clerk, and Euphemia's carriage was called without ceremony, Adeline remained in the gallery before the Falcon returns, at dawn. The lamps burned steadily now. Roland stood beside her, emptied of command. "You asked whether I would only punish them," he said. "You did more than punish them. Not enough. Enough for truth. Not enough for you." She turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He looked down, then back at her with no ducal mask left to save him. "May I kiss you, Adeline?" The question reached every part of her that had been ordered quiet by one house or another. She drew the tuning fork from her reticule and placed it in his hand, then covered it with hers. Yes, she stepped closer. He bent slowly, giving her time enough to change the world if she wished. She did not. His kiss was gentle, restrained, and trembling with all he had not demanded. When they parted, his forehead rested near hers without touching until she leaned the final inch. "I love you, Adeline, not because you saved Hollowmere, but because you made truth gentler than silence." Tears warmed her eyes. She did not look away. "I love you, Roland. I chose this house before it chose me, and I choose you now because you finally came to it honestly." His breath broke, not in weakness, in release. Beyond them, the true falcon faced the chapel end, wings raised, as if morning had at last become possible. By morning, Hollowmere had discovered the difference between exposure and restoration. Exposure had come the previous day in the long gallery, with papers laid out like instruments and truth drawn from them, until no polite lie could survive the sound. Restoration began more quietly. It began with Mrs. Harrow ordering the covers taken from every chair in the gallery, not because a guest required seating, but because empty chairs had become an insult. It began with Thomas carrying lamps without being told twice, and stopping once to look at the returned tapestry as if an old member of the household had come home under a wounded name. It began with Mrs. Vale standing beneath the Falcon Returns at dawn. spectacles misted, one trembling hand lifted toward the visible repair threads she had sewn years before. No one had hidden the damaged edge. Adeline had insisted upon that before breakfast. "If we mend it so no one can see where it was torn," she had said, "then we teach the house to lie more elegantly." Roland had heard her from the open doorway and answered before anyone else could. "Then it will be mended visibly." Now, just after 10 o'clock, he stood at the head of the long gallery before the household, the vicar, Mr. Quesnel, Lady Bracken, Mrs. Alton, and 2 tenant representatives, who had been invited because Hollowmere's silence had cost more than aristocratic pride. Adeline stood beside him, not behind him, wearing the same deep grey silk from the reckoning, though Mrs. Harrow had brushed it until the fabric looked new enough for ceremony. The tuning fork rested in Adeline's pocket, its ivory and ebony handle warm from her hand. Roland's voice carried through the gallery, with none of yesterday's brokenness hidden, and none of it used for display. "Mr. Fenman is no longer steward of this estate. Mr. Quesnel will place before the proper authorities every paper concerning the false sale, the forged instruction, the improper disposal of house property, and all funds or goods that may have been diverted through that fraud. Until a new steward is chosen, no estate inventory, account, or household order will be sealed from Her Grace." A murmur moved among servants and tenants, not disorderly, but alive. Mrs. Harrow lowered her head. Thomas stared straight ahead with the fierce solemnity of youth trusted unexpectedly. Roland continued. "Lady Euphemia Staveley left Hollowmere yesterday. She will not return by my invitation or under my protection. Any account that represents her conduct as concern for this house, my sister, or my wife is false." He turned then not to the witnesses, but to Adeline. "Her Grace's authority here was never a favour I had the right to grant. It was a truth I failed to honour. This morning, I correct that failure before the people who saw its cost." Adeline had prepared herself for public validation. She had not prepared for the quietness with which it entered her. No applause followed. Thank heaven! Applause would have made a performance of what needed to become law. Instead, Lady Bracken curtsied with the same grave respect she had shown the day before. Mrs. Alton wiped her eyes. The vicar bowed. The tenants looked at Adeline not as the abandoned bride who had stirred a ducal scandal, but as the woman who had asked what was missing from the walls and had not stopped until the house answered. Adeline stepped forward. "Hollowmere will not become a theatre of grief," she said, "nor will it become a theatre of vanity. This gallery will be restored because memory should not be kept in locked rooms or used as a weapon against the living. The household will receive proper records. The tenants will receive honest notice of changes that concern them. The servants will not be punished for speaking truth when truth is asked of them. And music will return here, not to drown the past, but to prove it no longer owns every silence." Mrs. Vale made a small sound and covered it with her hand. Roland did not speak over Adeline. He did not finish the promise for her. He stood beside her and listened while the room learned her voice in full. By noon, the consequences had taken shape beyond words. Fenman remained in custody of process, not drama, watched by men appointed through correct authority and facing ruin no clever bow could soften. His ledgers had been sealed by Quesnel. His private correspondence was being copied. The magistrate's clerk had ridden out with enough facts to ensure no inn along the York Road would mistake him for a wronged servant fleeing a tyrannical duchess. Euphemia's carriage had been seen leaving before dawn. But by afternoon, Lady Bracken had already sent a note to a cousin in Harrogate, coolly phrased and socially lethal. It did not call Euphemia wicked. It simply said that concern, in this instance, had been found poorly informed by evidence. Among women of rank, that would travel farther than fury. In the long gallery, the wounded tapestry was lifted at last into place. Roland helped secure the lower rod himself, his hands steady when they tightened the brass fitting that had once given way. Adeline watched from the center of the room while the falcon rose against the stone. Not perfect, not untouched, but returned. The bare rectangle around it remained visible at the edges. The other walls still waited. Waiting no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like work. That evening, when the witnesses had gone and the household had settled into the odd peace that follows public truth, Adeline entered the gallery alone and found it lit from end to end, not extravagantly, honestly. Lamps glowed along the walls. The chairs were uncovered. The small morning room pianoforte had been brought in and tuned as well as age allowed. Mrs. Vale had left a simple piece open on the stand, one Adeline's mother had loved, though Adeline had not told anyone that. She touched the page and felt tears rise, not as grief alone, but as recognition. Roland stood near the far windows, where dusk pressed blue against the glass. "Mrs. Vale asked me what you used to play," he said. "I told her I did not know." "Then, how did she choose this?" "She asked what your mother would have chosen if she wanted a room to forgive itself." Adeline laughed softly through the tears. "That is not a question most music maids would dare ask a duke. Hollowmere is becoming dangerous that way." He came nearer, but not too near. Even after love had been spoken, he seemed determined not to assume a right where trust should remain awake. "You asked me last night whether I wanted music here because I was grateful or because I wanted to live here. Yes. The answer is both insufficient and simple." He looked around the gallery at the returned tapestry, the uncovered chairs, the old instrument waiting. "I want to live here because you taught me that a house is not loyal when it preserves a man's cowardice. It is loyal when it calls him back to what he owes. I am grateful because you did not make my grief smaller. You made it honest enough to share." Adeline stood very still. "And if honesty is difficult, then I will not command silence because I am afraid of the sound." She crossed to the pianoforte and sat. Her fingers rested above the keys. For a moment, she was a girl again at Penrose Hall, trying to play softly enough not to disturb a father who mistook quiet daughters for dutiful ones. Then Roland moved to her side and turned the page slightly toward the lamplight. Not ahead of her, not instructing, waiting. The first note trembled. The second steadied. By the fifth, the gallery had begun to hold music without flinching. The melody was small, tender, almost plain, and because of that, it filled the room more completely than grandeur could have done. Roland turned the page. When she reached the end of it, his hand careful at the corner. When the piece finished, he did not praise her as if she had performed for him. He said, "It answered you." Adeline looked up. "No, it answered us." She reached for his hand first. The choice was deliberate. His palm opened at once, but he did not close his fingers until hers settled into his. Then he held her with the same care he had once given the tuning fork. Only now, there was no fear of sound between them. She rose, and when he opened his arms, she stepped into them freely. The embrace was quiet, complete, and unhurried. No witness required it. No scandal forced it. No title explained it. "I love you," he said against the stillness, not as a new confession, but as a promise that would need a lifetime of ordinary proof. "I love you, she answered, her cheek resting where his heart beat steady beneath her hand. Later, when the lamps burned low, and the servants came softly to close the room, they found the ivory and ebony tuning fork resting on the restored pianoforte beneath the falcon returns at dawn. Its engraved letters caught the candlelight, A.P., not erased by marriage, not hidden by grief. Beside it lay Roland's open hand, still holding Adeline's, while the once empty gallery held music without fear.